Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I'm joined today, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, my business partner, the dear, the sweet, dram golf, the white, Johnston Yellen.
It has come to pass this day. There is a mark on my front door. Whiskey lovers are stopping by. They're going on an adventure. They're not sure why, but they know they're in the right place.
Oh, you're doing a callback to The Hobbit. Look at that. I was expecting a little Lord of the Rings, but you went back all the way back to The Hobbit.
It's my first love.
Is it?
I remember reading that at 11 years old, not PM or AM, but just
being 10 minutes ago at 11.
Just being a young fellow and moving into that world and just thinking, gosh, it's so good, so good.
You know what's funny is I didn't read The Hobbit first. I read Lord of the Rings first.
You had me at I didn't read.
No, I've read Lord of the Rings like a good 15 to 20 times.
At least 15 to 20 times. No other books have ever been read by Hatton but Lord of the Rings. The one book he has.
Oh my gosh, I was addicted to it. I had a hardcore band, an elfcore band named after it.
I love your use of elfcore.
That's what we called ourselves. We were a distortionless hardcore band called Leaves of Lothlorien.
Did you all just pull these words out of a hat? You were like, these are the words, they now live in this order. This is now how we say it.
It totally is, and we wanted to see if people would follow that because it was silly, and people did. You know, in the 90s we did okay.
I like that you created musical subgenres the way you write tasting notes.
Yeah, it's true. My most recent band.
I wish listeners could have seen your face there. That was good. That was good.
Do you know how we're categorized in iTunes with my most recent band?
Bukkake Rock.
Yeah, Bukkake Rock.
I'm here for every one of your stories.
Look at that. I didn't know you remembered. I don't remember what stories I've told who, so I just tell them over and over and over again.
You're a gentleman reaching that age. Did I tell you when? Oh, we shot bloody foxes from the back of horses. Did I ever tell you about the time? Oh, bloody mom.
Oh, have I got a yarn for you, young Johnston Yellen?
Did you ever have an onion on your belt? I'm sure I've made that joke before on the podcast.
Have you ever had an onion on your belt? What does that mean?
That's Grandpa Simpson.
Huh.
This is doing fantastically.
Yeah,
Let me tell you about my weekend.
Oh, please do, because I'm curious. Said no one ever.
And I'm so used to it by now that I'm really well versed in talking into the void. So this fits perfectly with Westland being our focus today. I was invited to be part of that boutique whiskey company's World Whiskey Summit 2021.
Wait, which boutique whiskey company?
That boutique whiskey company.
Not this one. It was that one?
That one. That boutique whiskey company.
That boutique whiskey company. Got it. Continue. Sorry, I just wanted to be clear.
Do you always read it with the emphasis when you see the title? Do you always read it with that boutique whiskey company?
No, it's all monotone. It's that boutique whiskey company. It's just da 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 da.
Oh, that's a shame. You should get more emphasis in there.
So where do you put your emphasis? That boutique whiskey company. Do you do it like that?
Exactly, yes. Yeah, I emphasize the hyphen. As one does. So anyway, I was invited to be part of that as a white guy with a beard. That was the segment, the recurring segment. But I have to say this, they intended to do 2 hours on YouTube and Facebook, and they ran for 2.5. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was so well put together. And the topics, there was diversity and inclusion. There was sustainability and kind of environmental. And then there was a third that I'm blanking on. I want to say like new grains were part of it. I do know I talked about new grains, gave me a chance to talk about Dan Barber, Third Plate, Matt Hofmann, Westland, Mixed Mash Bill, like all the things we're about to discuss with Matt in this interview. I got to allude to them in my time. But I actually sat with a wee glass of the new Colere, which you and I are going to pronounce 50,000 different ways over the course of this podcast, so long as I don't make a return to pronouncing it cholera, which did not go over particularly well with Mr. Matt Hofmann.
Yeah,
I didn't do it on purpose.
No.
You know, I wasn't trying to be an asshole. I just was.
It was just a shame that you actually had cholera. That's the sad thing.
Yeah. Is that like dysentery?
I think I think it precedes dysentery.
Who doesn't want their brand associated with this conversation?
So Colare, so go on.
So we did, it is from the Latin. And so James Foster right now is just pulling his hair out as he listens to us butchering Latin. P-in remains the one correction that he made that is so deeply embedded in my brain now. It really is pronounced P-in, and I've pronounced it 100 different ways so that it doesn't sound like P-in my whole life. And P-in is correct. So maybe he'll write in and tell me you were right with cholera, but I doubt it. But interestingly, we did with Matt get to discuss grains and farming and farmers and agriculture and soil and healthy soil and sustainable practices. And so it really was great to be able to represent the good Westland name, even just in passing. And then I have to tell you, because I know you and I did this a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Lee and Bree Atwood. Lee, he of the creation of Dramgalf. And after I was done with my Westland, I went ahead and poured a little bit of the backwoods. And I was sipping on the backwoods as I continued on with the World Whisky Summit. And I know we mentioned it to Lee and Bree, and I don't know if we've got it on wax, and I don't know if it'll show up in a future episode or in the future episode. Yeah. But I was continually reminded of that cherry, chocolate, truffle note that is in the backwoods rye matured in Shiraz cask. And the reason that I went ahead and poured the backwoods is because of that story of the rye sitting dormant in a dry Australian field for 50 years and then being brought back to life. And we'll bring that back up when we talk to Lee. But I just wanted to, I thought of you as I sat there sipping on it, and it just kept drawing my attention. I was like, yeah, this is Joshua's observation with this pour, that even if you're just sitting sipping on it doing something else, it grabs you by the collar and pulls you back.
It pulls you back every single time. You can't ignore it. Yep.
You cannot. And then just for funsies, towards the end of the broadcast, I poured the Single Cask Nation Penderyn Single Cask.
Oh, good idea.
The Grand Cru Bordeaux. And I thought, I think their emphasis is on world as opposed to world whiskey with the summit. But I went with world whiskies just for the fun of it, just because I could.
So that's interesting. So, back to the emphasis. This was more a world thing. It wasn't a focus particularly on whiskey, just a global conversation.
Well, I think it was a whiskey summit drawing upon the world as opposed to a summit about world whiskey.
Got it. I got it. Look at that. There's the emphasis.
Yep. But Jason Parker appeared in it a fair few times. Jason Parker of Copperworks, who we've had on the podcast.
Yeah.
And he was fantastic as well. Love listening to him. And then, a number of other friends popped up. It is still available, actually. If you do want to go see it, you can do a search for World Whisky Summit 2021, and you will find it.
Oh, lovely.
YouTube, Facebook, hell, just Google it and see what happens.
Oh,
It's well worth everybody's time. If you're the type of person who would listen to this podcast, that is well worth your time. A lot of different voices, a range of voices, and as I say, the topics were really good, and the comments made were insightful. Not by me, but by other people. They were well worth listening to.
I wish I had a chance to watch that. As you know, I was doing my own World Whiskey Day event with Drammers Club. And I wasn't even able to enjoy that entire session because, family things going on. So I went in for my 20 minutes, and we had David Cover from Pandera in with his 20 minutes. But it was a cool event where brands can come in, and you had 20 minutes to talk about a whiskey and talk about your brand and how it fits within the world whiskey scene, and it's just fun. There was a long period of time where I was loving Zoom, and then I got Zoom fatigue, and then I was loving Zoom again, and then I was getting Zoom fatigue, and then I stayed in Zoom fatigue for a while. But now I'm loving it again from the standpoint of I'm getting to see all the people that I know and love within the whiskey world. And I know because many of us are getting vaccinated, we're not too far away from actually hugging these people and sharing drams with these people. And so I'm starting to feel like this unusual spring fever. Where you're almost there. Summer's almost here, And so I'm excited about Zoom again. I'm excited about seeing people on Zoom, and more excited about seeing them in person soon as well.
It's funny you talk about the in-person. I will be conducting my first in-person interview for the first time since... no idea. I don't know what the answer is. January of 2020, when you and I were in London interviewing John Glazer and Sukhinder Singh and James Saxon.
Yes. Yeah, that was our last foray out and our last joint interview with anybody, live at least.
Did we interview anybody in Scotland when we jumped up there from London in January of 2020?
I'm sure we did, but my brain is escaping me.
Right, and so there you go. So Bill Thomas will be of Jack Rose Dining Saloon in DC will be my first in person.
Oh, lovely!
Since January of 2020. How crazy is that? It's so bizarre that I'm trying to think that has to be wrong. We must have conducted an in-person during COVID with masks, 6 feet apart, and I don't think we did.
Do you remember the sign that would say 6 feet apart is better than 6 feet under?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
All right. We're remembering things now.
We are. Slowly but surely. Anyway.
That takes me back to March.
So we have Matt Hofmann with us today. And what excites me about this episode is the past few episodes with Matt Hofmann have been focused on April Fools. Mm-hmm. And our last, I wouldn't say, I shouldn't say our April Fool's conversations weren't real conversations. They were more fun conversations. But our first, down and dirty, let's get into the nitty gritty of things. The last time we did that at Westland was our live event at the distillery.
Far too long ago.
Right? Skinny Roberts was on there. Matt, the gentleman, his name is escaping me. The winemaker was there as well.
I always love it when you start going down those paths and I can see the exact
yes.
path you're about to walk down. I'm like, I have no idea what the winemaker was called. He was a lovely, lovely guy and his contribution was fantastic. Yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't used his name since that live event. I'm like, I wonder how Joshua's going to get out of this cul-de-sac.
He's not.
Nope, he's not. Just going to buy a house, move in.
If anybody's curious as to what that gentleman's name is, you can check out our website, onenationunderwhiskey.com/ I don't know.
The good news is he's not a regular listener, so we're not offending him to his ears right now.
If he does listen to this, we greatly apologize. He was absolutely lovely, and he made me interested in wine. So there you go. I actually started drinking a little wine since our conversation with him. So he's made an impact. Though his name is
fucked if I know what he's called.
But anyway, back to our conversation with Matt. What I really enjoyed about this one is rather than get into the geeky ins and outs of production once malted barley is in house, this is focusing a bit more on, like you had said, on the growing of the barley, on the agriculture, on sustainable practices and things like that. And it's so very important and so very interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think you said it towards the beginning of our time with Matt. It was a catch-up on all things Westland. You know, not only are we talking about the new release in the Outpost series or what they're now going to be doing with grain moving forward or reused casks going forward, but also what does the future hold for their standard line. And there had been rumours that we'd heard about changes, and we got to ask Matt directly. And he was very forthcoming. There were some things he told us about. We recorded this in April, I believe, after April Fools.
After April Fools, yes. Yep.
Yeah, we returned and had a conversation. And he was telling us some things that were in the pipeline, and since then they have come to fruition. They're on their website as general knowledge. But there's some other things that he's going to tell us about that we're going to revisit after the interview.
Oh, you're such a tease, Jason. Such a tease. In a good way. So shall we hand the mics over to ourselves and Matt Hofmann?
Let's go.
Matt Hofmann, thank you so much for joining us today. It's funny, you know, we seem to have gotten into this I wouldn't call it a rut, but we got into something where we said, okay, it's April Fool's, so let's have another Westland episode. Okay, it's April Fool's again. Let's have another Westland episode. But I think the last time we had a serious Westland conversation was when we did our live event at the distillery Jeepers Creepers. Was that 2018 now? Or 2000?
Could have been 18, could have been 17, could have been something else.
Yeah. So
Too long.
Too long. Perfect. Well said. So with that said, you know, it's been 3 to 4 years. And I imagine in those 3 to 4 years, new things other than special, other than April Fool's events, April Fool's things has happened. So take us up to speed, man. Like, what are you excited about in the past 4 years? What's been going on in Westland as you've been ramping up to now? Because I know, you know, in a little bit we're going to be talking about some new releases and new lines of whiskey that you'll be launching. But what have you been doing the past 4 years leading up to this new range of whiskeys that you'll be launching?
Oh man, there's a lot. I mean, the past 4 years we've been really, really busy. I think as a general rule at Westland, we try to stay busy and keep ourselves moving forward constantly. The really big thing has been Garyana continuing to grow. That first came out in 2016, but it has now continued to grow, getting that to our fans, not just in the U.S., but around the world. We also started the planting program that we had. So that began in 2017, the replanting of Gary Oaks in the native Gary Oak savannas as a part of the Garyana program, is putting Gary Oaks back into the grounds and helping to restore this ecosystem that is quite central to parts of the Pacific Northwest. But a really big thing that's been moving along has been the work that we've been doing in agriculture, I would say, especially over the past 3 years. We've been working on it since 2012, and we'll get into this, but things have really begun to accelerate, especially it was in the very end of 2019. We committed to fully funding a PhD student who was going to spend 4 years outside of the commodity system developing new barley varietals with a new set of goals, and I'm sure we could talk about that, as well as getting closer to agriculture ourselves, which includes some of our own barley farming, which we're actually going to get into for the first time this year.
Wow.
That's going to be a whole thing. So
wow, on Westland,
we haven't really talked publicly about that yet.
So you'll be
on
growing
Westland soil.
On Westland soil. That's fantastic. Okay, continue, please. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Is this
So this is
this happening on First Avenue, just down from Safeco Field?
Yeah, it's that little plot right underneath the trees where all the birds poop. We've had this big commitment to the Skagit Valley, as you guys know, where we've been sourcing a lot of the barley over especially the past 4, 5, 6 years, increasing percentages, and there's just really something special that's going on up there. And we got to a point where we said, okay, we need to move actually our barrels, our rack houses. We needed to find a new home for those, as well as an expanded bottling line. And so we said, okay, if we're going to do that, there's no room to do any of that stuff in Seattle. We're already in kind of as big of a place as you can realistically get in Seattle. So if you're going to do that, what's your second home now? And that second home now is going to be Skagit. So along with that, we purchased a farm. It's actually the same contiguous piece of land, only one part's agriculture, one part's not. And we'll be planting barley on it in just a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Spring barley is on its way.
Wow.
That's very cool.
It really is. And we're basically using this farm as something in between like a proper farm. We are not professional farmers. But what we're doing with the bread lab and the research that's going on, there's little test plots. There's a step that's going between these test plots. When the research students and everybody else there at Washington State University are developing these new barley varietals, it starts, literally with like one barley stalk, and then it goes to, a little plot, and then a little, 1 foot by 6 foot row, and then it continues to grow. But when we get to a new barley varietal that is really interesting outside of the commodity system, it is a big ask for a farmer to take on this new barley varietal that's a complete unknown. So our thought process here is, let us be a part of that system. Let us take on some of that risk with you. So we will be the first ones to grow one of these new barley varietals at scale and really test it under kind of proper, not micromanaged agricultural conditions, under what would we consider normal farming conditions, with a professional farmer who's there. He's the one doing the work. But we're able to say, okay, this is what we're going to learn in real time, in the same type of soil that the farmers in the rest of the Skagit Valley are learning on. We could take that and then use that information to help the farmers if they want to get that varietal out and grow it in other places in the valley.
Okay.
So it's like a really big test kitchen or something in between that kind of pure research phase and pure commercial phase, if that makes sense. But definitely enough to make whiskey out of, to be clear.
And right, and so with that in mind, again, going back to the last time we were at the distillery, in addition to selecting some casks with you that we're incredibly excited to release soon, you also tasted us through a bunch of different new makes that were highlighting specific barley varieties. And I'll never forget, I think it was called Talisman, that tasted like tomato soup. Like that one was just wild.
Obsidian.
Is it Obsidian? Okay.
And then it was the tomato soup one, the famous tomato soup one. In a good way. I mean, it sounds absurd, but
Yeah.
I like tomato soup. Who doesn't like tomato soup?
Right?
So,
yeah. Talisman was the grilled cheese one, right? And you do the grilled cheese and the tomato soup.
We blend those two together to achieve the perfect Sunday lunch. So.
So doing all of those tests, with the different barley varietals that you had acquired through Skagit Valley. I imagine that helped inform the type of barley that you're looking to plant on your own barley farm. So I'm curious, or your own section of the barley farm. And so I'm curious, what varieties did you land on and why?
Well, for this first year, we're going to be planting Laureate, which is a relatively known, it's a newer varietal, but it's not one that is going to cause us a tremendous amount of heartache for this first year of literally learning how to manage this process. What's coming behind it is the work that Louis Prager is this PhD student who's working on these new varietals along with Dr. Steve Jones and the rest of the team at the Bread Lab. That's going to take a little bit of time. You've got to, it literally does take years to scale those things to a certain degree. So there's a couple of things we're trialing first. One is getting the farming part under our belt, especially for this first year, and then getting rotations under our belt as well. So there's a couple of things here, which is we're not just planting barley, we as in the broad barley industry in the Skagit Valley in particular, not planting barley in a vacuum, they're planting it in rotation with other crops. So if you're going to do that, you can't just not pay attention to those rotations. You've also got to see, how does that barley harvest and planting work if you've got to plant, tulips next or potatoes next or whatever it may be. And in fact, this also gives us the ability to test rotation crops, especially in more low environmental impact agricultural systems. So the farm is certified salmon safe, which is a designation we use out here to protect stream runoff. It has also this crop will be certified organic, so long as we don't screw up the paperwork. So all of this stuff will be with organic as a baseline. And so the idea here is let's use these low environmental impact agricultural systems, not just for barley, but the other things that the farmers are growing in the valley, to test all of that stuff out. So it is much bigger than just an estate barley project, right? It's kind of it's some degree of scale, but as a laboratory at the same time. So we have seen the stuff that we've been really excited about. There are really exciting varietals. The easiest bucket to get super excited about is the dark varietals, the purples, the blacks, the blues, the reds. That stuff, especially when you see those compounds are linked, most of them with anthocyanins, which is a compound in grapes that gives it its or linked to flavor in wine grape skins. So that's the sort of stuff that we're pursuing a lot right now, especially with the Bread Lab. So we'll see. This is a long-term proposition here,
So, you just really quickly, I just want to dig deeper into this barley thing because, Scottish producers typically are not talking about the barley, and if barley is brought up, it's usually brought up by some whiskey nerd who says, "Yeah, so what sort of barley are you using?" Right? And then they'll say, "We're using Concerto, we're using Optic, we're using whatever." But the reason that they're using, select the barley of the month is that there's a certain amount of yield that comes along with it and comes along with the yeast that you're using. And this is one of the things that I've always loved about Westland. And Jason and I talked about this on our last One Nation Under Whiskey podcast, is that Westland has always made it a point to not just focus on the final product, which is the whiskey, but on the product that you're about to ferment, that you're about to turn into alcohol. You're creating a mixed mash bill of different barley varieties to give you different flavors. And so I'm curious, you talked about red barleys and purple barleys and blue barleys and all this. And this is something that most people don't even think about. I know I don't think about it. And I only discovered these different varieties through you because of talking with you. So how rare are some of these barleys, and is this species something that is repeatable? Are these like heirloom species that just grow if you focus on it, or what's the deal with these unusual barleys?
Well, let me do this. The idea of the farm, as we've been talking about, is quite interesting because I've actually jumped the gun a little bit, because if we follow this kind of logic chain, the farm appears at the end. So I'm going to try to link all this stuff together. Where this all started was, as you described, us looking at the raw ingredients as the source of whiskey flavor. And that sounds obvious. I mean, probably not to most of your listeners, because most of your listeners will have heard the general idea that 70 to 80% of the flavor comes from the cask. It's what everybody in this industry says.
Yeah.
But as I've said multiple times, it doesn't have to be that way. That's a choice. But it always seems so obvious to us. When you look at the brewing industry, the roasted malts they use, there's a ton of flavor there. And that's where we started. Cask number one started with the roasted malt recipe. We built our house style on top of that core idea of raw ingredient flavor. So the thing is, when we started the company, there was a lot of different roasted malts out there that have been used by the brewing industry. So we were able to utilize some of those to make, this kind of, we call this a 5-malt recipe in our house style. But within 2 years, we found the limit of what that system would provide.
Okay.
And the things that were missing there, one was local peat, which wasn't happening. That's kind of a slightly different issue. But the other big thing was, barley varietals themselves. And barley varietals, unlike the wine industry, you just look at that adjacent to the whiskey industry, and they look at, there's, thousands of different wine varietals used by the wine industry around the world.
Sure.
And the whiskey industry uses, a handful, 5, at most, really, in any one given time. So it was there that the question was posed. And we go, okay, why is it that wine grape varietals can exist and you can make different wines out of those and they have their own flavor profile, but we're not doing that in whiskey? And the answer to that is long and complex, but generally the idea is that whiskey and barley itself is part of a commodity system, a commodity agricultural system.
Yeah.
And it's designed to not do what you see in the wine industry, which is where you see a bunch of different grape varietals to produce a bunch of different types of wine. It's designed to make the same thing over and over and over again. And it's effective at that, right? I mean, as a machine, it's effective. But all of that stuff prevents you from finding any, terroir influences in most malted barley, because all of it's taken from different places and blended together. It's all the same barley varietal, or maybe 2 or 3 that were all designed to taste exactly the same. If they were even allowed to have flavor at all, which flavor would be seen as a defect. And it would be, grown and sprayed under kind of relatively terrible environmental conditions as well. So we started to look at this. We had no idea what we were doing. And we went up to the Skagit Valley for a conference. It's called the Kneading Conference back then, 2012. And we talked to these guys. At that time, we were actually going to start our own malting company. And thank God we didn't do that. But we were going to start our own malting company after we had started Westland. Yeah. And we sat down opposite from these guys at this conference, and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we run a single malt distillery, and we're trying to, we want to start a malting company as well, because we want to do these barley varietals, and nobody wants to do it. Here to meet some farmers. What are you guys doing here?" They said, "We're starting a malting company." And that serendipity was just beautiful. I swear it happened exactly like that.
Wow.
And the thing where that started was there was this moment in time, this beautiful, serendipity, just this kind of spark that happened in the Skagit Valley, where farmers were looking for a new way to make money on barley. There was the researchers there that were basically kicked out of the commodity system, kicked out of the commodity grain system. And then you have people like us who are trying to use new barley varietals. And this is the real challenge with doing something like this, is that you need all of those people involved. You need the farmers, the researchers, the maltsters, the distillers, the brewers, and ultimately people who are going to buy that whiskey at the tail end. Yeah. So that's the origin of where all of this started.
And so from not becoming maltsters, you ended up becoming farmers, or leaning on farmers to become growers.
So there's a lot of steps that happened in between there. So one of the big things that happened right away was these barley farmers were saying, okay, first of all, they're not just growing barley. They're growing 80 different crops of commercial significance in the Skagit Valley. So this valley, which is about an hour's drive north of Seattle, if you're me, it's
farther from Glasgow.
It's one of these few places. It's one of these few places where you don't see mono and bi-crop agriculture. It's not corn or corn soybean. Yeah. It's high-end agriculture because they can't compete on price. Yeah. So the whole thing is this is a really expensive part of North America. Compete on quality. So they've been growing barley there, but they weren't growing barley to make money. They're growing barley because of agricultural reasons. For every acre of barley that they would grow, they might get 3 tons of per acre to the maltster, but they put 8 tons of organic matter of carbon back into the ground. So if they've got crops that pull up a lot of carbon from the ground, a lot of the cash crops really do that. Barley puts it back into the soil. Yeah. So that's one big thing. Second thing, lots of fertility in these soils, lots of clay, lots of minerals, but it compacts. Barley and other small grains like wheat and rye shoot these amazing roots down into the soil very quickly and help to break up that clay soil apart. So these farmers are growing barley for those 2 reasons, and it breaks disease cycles when you rotate crops so that you don't need to use pesticides. It's the old-fashioned way of farming that everybody seems to have forgotten over the past 100 years. And so they started with this journey, and they said, okay, we want to grow barley for somebody, but there's just no west of the Cascades out here in Western Washington, the kind of, when people think of Washington State or Seattle, what they're thinking of, the rainy, drizzly climate, it's not in the commodity zone. Yeah. Because the commodity zone, quote unquote, is the, Eastern Washington State over to Wisconsin. So it was taking that stuff and Skagit Valley Malting saying, let's take these varietals that you're growing in this place that aren't approved for the commodity system and are actually too good. I mean, I'll get to this in a second. Too good for the commodity system. And let's malt them. And the thing is, what we have to do is we have to adapt our malting machines. We want to create malting machines that adapt to all of these different barley varietals that you're growing, rather than saying you have to grow this one barley varietal, even if it doesn't grow in this particular area. And what I mean by this idea of too good. So literally the grains that they were growing in Skagit were too plump. They were too big. This is actually a more ideal, Western Washington is actually a more ideal place to grow barley than the rest of the commodity part of the country. Wow. So literally, it wouldn't go into the malting machines from stuff that was used to the Dakotas or Wisconsin because it was thriving too much. That's how crazy it is.
Well, and with that said, it makes me wonder a little bit about your production. Obviously, and it's been a couple of years since we've been at the distillery with you, but knowing your use of Belgian brewer's yeast, knowing your cold crashing, knowing your clear wort going into, and your clear wash going into distillation, do your production techniques change with changing barley?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing is that we want to explore barley varietal flavor, right? At the same time, when you're working, kind of off-piste, I guess, as it were, when you're outside of the commodity system, there are no rules. Yeah. I mean, there is value in the commodity system structure. The size of the grain, how friable it's going to be, how much husk there's going to be, how much yield, et cetera. I mean, when we're doing all these new varietals, it's like the Wild West in the mash tun. It's so you're trying these new things all the time, and you try to roll with the same system, but to a certain extent, you can't sometimes. Great example, that obsidian that we were talking about earlier, that doesn't have a husk. So, the husk, which is famously used as part of the filtering mechanism in a mash tun, this doesn't have that at all. Wow. So, and so you just have to go on. Just have to roll with that stuff and just kind of embrace that it's going to be a little bit different. And sometimes in the distillation, it's a little bit different as well. So it's not, while there's a kind of a scientific instinct to try to keep all the variables the same, except for the varietals themselves. Yeah. And we try to as much as possible. Ultimately we're a whiskey distillery and we're making whiskey and it needs to taste good. So we're also not going to either make a technique that's going to not work or produce a new make spirit that we don't think tastes very good. So we got to conform to that.
But it seems that besides tasting good, it also has to be affordable. And one of the things, the reason the commodity grains become commodity grains is because it's a place where you can reduce your costs. how aware do you need to be of the economics of this?
Well, we're very aware because actually it's not affordable at all. Not right now. So everybody is operating in the commodity system. I mean, like there are maybe no exceptions to that, except for people who occasionally use bare barley or an old batch of Golden Promise. We're not in the commodity system anymore. So, we're utilizing these new barley varietals, and for the most part, they start at double the price per pound and go up to triple, sometimes even 4 times the price. And a big part of that is like, okay, we can try that, but there needs to be, we're running a business at the same time. There needs to be results. There needs to be something that's different and distinct. Yep. And the same thing is true of like sustainable initiatives, right? If you want to make an organic version of a product or whatever, that is more expensive to do. So the thought process is try to hit all of these buttons at the same time. More sustainable agricultural systems, more economic viability for the farmer, and new varietals that are designed to taste really interesting, really amazing. So we combine all that stuff together into this package, and it costs more, but ultimately we're not competing on price with commodity barley and the whiskey that comes out, including the whiskey that we make ourselves that is made with commodity barley, right? So the ultimate goal, though, Jason, is to try to get there, is to try to get to that point where the cost maybe not all the way come down to full commodity prices, because it's actually not so much about the barley itself as it is the economies of scale that a big maltster has. I mean, a big malting company, what they're doing is they're taking barley from all these different parts of a giant growing area it's all grown the same, right? And it's all dumped into grain elevators. It's all mixed up together. They're not trying to keep anything separate because they're all growing the same varietal, because that's the point. And then all that stuff goes to the malting company. They're blending it up again, and in rail cars and barges. Like, it is a big, impressive operation, again, from like an engineering standpoint. So even if you, beat like the yield per acre measurement, which we do with some of these new varietals that we're using, we are actually beating industry standard yield per acre. But when you're malting at smaller scale, or you want to preserve, one farmer's crop, all that stuff is much more expensive.
Sure.
And that's okay, because we think people are, that's kind of what you're paying for in the whiskey is all that stuff.
And that brings me to the last point I was going to make, and then Joshua, I'll throw it right back over to you. Cool. But and one of the things that we sometimes talk about in different tastings is some of the larger players, rather than educate the consumer, would rather remove a component that potentially confuses a consumer, chill filtering being an example, right? As you just start to mention it here about you believe people will spend their money in that direction, how much do you think about the consumer, and how much do you think about the education of the consumer to get them to look at that price, and instead of saying, "Pooh, Westland are over there ripping the arse out of it," instead are able to say, "I know why this is the price." It seems like a big gamble to take, but you've always been willing to take it. Yeah,
we are. Our risk tolerance is probably too high at Westland. But roughly probably at least for the past 5 years, 40% of the liquid that we're laying down, we're putting into casks, is stuff that nobody, including ourselves, has ever done before. Right? Just that proportion is you can really tell like where our focus is, right? So, and the thing is, a lot of these things they won't pan out. We haven't really had we've used 20 different barley varietals at Westland, which is, I think more than, the entire Scottish whiskey industry combined.
Sounds like
and some of them, none of them haven't been bad. Some of them, though, will taste too close to typical Copeland or Concerto varietal, and maybe it won't be super spectacular. So what do you do with that? So there's a lot of risk involved with that as well, in addition to the fact that it's already more expensive. But at the core of it, we believe, Westland, our whole thing from the beginning, as you were saying at the beginning of this chat here, was looking at flavor coming from raw ingredients, right?
Yep.
If you're looking for maximum age statement 10, 15, 18, 20, 25 at Westland, and I'm not saying those can't be great whiskeys, you're just not going to find it here, First of all, because we're a 10-year-old company. Second of all, because our focus is on finding that flavor the way that a winemaker would look at flavor, the way that a brewer would look at flavor, and the way that a chef increasingly would look at flavor, farm to table dining. And this is these things, we see these parallels, right? And we talk about, whiskey consumers, whiskey drinkers. We see these parallels that are happening in these adjacent industries, beer, wine, food. And there are so many people who have this approach to the things that they drink that are focused on terroir and provenance, and unique varietals and things like that. And we believe that the whiskey industry is ripe for that sort of change. Now, it won't be everybody. It won't even be most people, but there's enough people out there, I think, that are seeing that there are other ways of making whiskey. Yeah. If you look at what is happening in mezcal, easy example, mezcal to me is the most exciting spirit category in the world, including whiskey. And we make whiskey because of that. The approach that they have in mezcal is very much similar to what we're trying to do, but they do it as a category, generally speaking. So we see the fact that everybody is really, really excited about that stuff and go, okay, there is demand for this, and it's not just now, but like in the future, because this is years and years and years worth of work. Yeah.
No, everything you just said leads me into the question that I had. A few years back, Westland was purchased by Remy, and in a way paired you guys up with Bruichladdich, right? You actually, the last time we saw you in person was on Islay at the Bruichladdich distillery during Vigil.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Completely by chance, right?
Completely by chance. Yeah. But what I enjoy about the two distilleries is this part of the story coming out of both distilleries is that you're trying to focus on a sense of place, right? Where Bruichladdich is talking about Islay, and it's talking about Islay barley and what that could potentially do, what that could taste like. And then here we are talking about Westland and the different barley varietals. But my question is, and I want to make sure that I pose it correctly, do you believe in the idea of terroir, or do you think that there's more differentiation from barley variety to barley variety? And then just to add on to that point, if you believe it is terroir, would you compare it to, say, the wine world, right? Because we've been dipping our toes in wine during this discussion where, if you want a good Cabernet, well, look to California or look to France because, typically speaking, that's where the better Cabernet comes from. Like, would you say that it's a mixture of the two, that it's not just variety, but it's also the place in which that barley was grown?
Yeah, all of the above. And this terroir is a really big, complicated question. The first place to start is with the definition of terroir itself. So one of the main things that I think we have lost in the American translation of terroir is the idea that it's limited to just the agricultural parts of growing grapes, or in our case here, growing grain. And you hear most people, talking about, when it comes to wine, the spacing of the vines in the vineyard and the slope and the aspect and how rocky it is and the calcium carbonate content and all this other stuff, which absolutely does make an impact. But speaking with, French people, one of the things that they notice when we talk about terroir, that they say, oh, you're actually missing the people element. And there's this element of terroir that includes people and their local culture, that also goes into their broad definition of terroir. So under both definitions, I think the answer is yes, is that terroir in whiskey is absolutely a thing. First of all, we can look at, with barley varietals being grown in the commodity system, terroir is a choice. Unfortunately, it's not an easy choice to make if you're a distiller, because as a distiller, you typically don't have a ton of control, if any, over the commodity system.
Yeah.
Because what the commodity grain system is designed to do is literally to eliminate environmental terroir ideas. Like that's actually the point, is to make it consistent. Terroir differences is the opposite of consistency. So they're trying to take these things and blend them together, and they do blend them together to make a consistent product. and not just between different farming areas, different farms, but also between years. They're trying to iron out differences in vintage characteristics as well.
Okay.
So one of the reasons when there's an argument about just that pure kind of agricultural definition of terroir is that it's focused primarily on, what you can see in front of you as an industry. And what most of the whiskey industry sees in front of it is, in our case, barley, but the same thing is true for the bourbon industry and corn and all the rest. This comes from a big homogenous place. It's all ironed out to be the same. But if you focus on these things individually, absolutely, you can see these differences in terroir. So there's that big part of it all by itself, right? Mm-hmm. The second thing is that human definition, and this is where I think you use this comparison to Bruichladdich. I think that's really valid here. Not just with the differences between what grows on Islay and what grows here in the Pacific Northwest, and there are big differences in terms of barley agriculture and what goes into that, but there's a big people difference here. There's the way that we're approaching things culturally. In the Pacific Northwest, it's blank slate. Everything is brand new. This is obviously a big tech-heavy part of the world. There's boundless optimism, in trying to come up with new ways of doing things. You also can't fall back on the old ways of doing things because you don't know those old ways of doing things. So you just got to keep moving forward. And so that's really manifested in taking those, raw ingredients, which have their own environmental terroir. And now the difference is magnified because both distilleries lean into our respective cultures. Bruichladdich leans into Islay. We lean into Pacific Northwest. And we don't try to, homogenize it or make it be like some, holy standard somewhere. And so we try to embrace that. And there's a ton of ways that both distilleries do that.
Well, and I have to say, with this pairing in mind, that the two best hours I've spent in all of lockdown and all of the last COVID 13 months or so was the 2 hours of you and Adam Hannett having a conversation on Instagram, those two separate 1 hour blocks. That was the best 120 minutes spent. Listening to the two of you was brilliant. I emailed you shortly after watching the second one, and I said, I'm watching the future of the whiskey industry right here. And it was so exciting, incredibly exciting to see the way the two of you think about the industry and think about distilleries, distilling, but also farmers and barley and wood. It's really remarkable. So I had to get that on wax, giving you the...
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We do feed off of each other. We don't have exactly the same approach. There isn't like a centralized strategy that we both have. It's just that the reason we're sister distilleries is because we both believe the same thing, and it's not like we have to constantly check, are you being good at terroir? Are you being good at terroir? It's just very natural to us. And then we get ourselves together, and we just have a blast talking about what the possibilities are. Then they'll have a perspective that we couldn't possibly have, and vice versa, and things. And that really helps. I mean, that's so important, this idea of perspective. There are so many things that we wanted to do and tried to do, when we set out on this journey in 2012 to get out of a commodity system to find these new barley varietals. I had no idea that there was such a thing as red barley. Mm-hmm. And nobody had seen that stuff before.
Yeah.
I used to joke, as kind of true, you show that to people in the Scottish whiskey industry, and they'll think that it's covered in some sort of advanced mold. It's just you just don't see it at all. And the reason why we're able to push forward in this way is because we do have these perspectives that are coming at it with the same degree of passion that we are. Not just between us as whiskey makers, us and Bruichladdich, but us, Skagit Valley Malting, they're passionate about malting, and at the bread lab and the farmers themselves, they're able to think of things and considerations that we could never dream of because we don't come from that world. And we have all of that stuff. We let all that stuff grow together.
Yeah. And with that said, if I can make a recommendation again that I made an episode or two ago, the book by Dan Barber, The Third Plate, talks more about the bread lab and talks more about the Skagit Valley. And actually in there, he talks about the way in which something like barley breaks down the soil and the value to farmers through that as well. So for all listeners who are interested in that aspect, definitely pick up Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate. It's well worth your time and well worth your hard-earned pennies. With all of this,
there's a lot of.
Go on.
I was just going to say, there's just so much to learn from the world of cuisine. From chefs, from the farm to table. I don't know if you call it an industry, but movement, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we learn more from chefs. I feel like, at least I do at this moment in time. I feel like I learn more from chefs than I do from the rest of the whiskey industry, actually, by far. There's just a lot of ideas. And to be fair, they can develop ideas much faster. It's take this thing, grow this thing, cook this thing, eat, result, change. Whereas, we're just about ready to release the first whiskey of this project that started 9 years ago,
Which brings us very nicely to what we're about to talk about, is this upcoming project. So please take it away, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why we're here talking to you guys today is because, well, besides the fact that we like both of you, is
cheers.
Yeah, cheers. I didn't have to. I wasn't forced to say that at all. So
yeah, I can see Steve Hawley in the background there.
Yeah. So so we just have this new whiskey. Everything that we've been building towards here over these past 9 years. It's crazy to say because it was summer of 2012 when we went to this conference at the Bread Lab, Skagit Valley, Washington State University Extension Center. And we started working with these guys at the time. Skagit Valley Malting was a machine in a garage. I mean, it's very much like West Coast, entrepreneurial story, and there's always a garage involved, and they're embarrassed to actually show this machine, and it was like seriously like the nicest like technological marvel, that's this 50-gallon drum, malting machine that they started with. But anyways, that program is scaled and scaled and scaled to the point where now they've got all these machines that are 10-ton malting machines. Each one is designed to operate independently so that they can focus on different barley varietals. And so what we've got now is we've been using barley from Skagit Valley Malting and now a couple of other craft maltsters that have popped up since they opened, but since 2014. And the whole idea with this program is to focus on breaking out of the commodity system, to find new barley varietals. Maybe they could be approved by the commodity system, but typically the ones that are super interesting are not approved by the commodity system. So looking for barley varietals that have a lot of interesting flavor, which would automatically get them kicked out of the commodity system. It could be a 2-row, it could be a 6-row, it could be a winter, it could be a spring. It doesn't matter what it is. So we've been working with them over these past 6-7 years in terms of actually making whiskey out of it. And now we are finally ready to release the first edition of a whiskey series that is going to kind of output the results of this work. And that whiskey we're calling Colere. Colere is a Latin word. It means to cultivate. And the whole idea there is that this is a fundamentally new way of us looking at barley and our own relationship to barley agriculture. Because it's not just the varietals themselves, it's the whole system that goes into it. So Colere Edition 1 is this amazing. The story behind it is actually really cool because this whole story in Skagit Valley kicked off with this farmer who was growing this varietal called Alba. It's a winter 6-row varietal. And he was saying, look, I'm growing this barley varietal here. It's not on the approved commodity system, but I'm growing it because it's doing these amazing things for my fields. He was a tulip farmer. He says it's just making his fields really, really fertile after he plants this barley varietal in there. So, but barley is the 80th most valuable crop, literally the least valuable crop grown in the Skagit Valley. And so he says, I need to grow this barley for all of these agricultural reasons and agronomic reasons, but there's no way for me to sell it because it doesn't go into the commodity system.
Yeah.
So he started working with the Bread Lab, and at the time was the infant idea of Skagit Valley Malting. This was in 2009, I guess. And they said, okay, we're going to take this barley varietal and malt it and adapt our malting machines to fit this 6-row winter barley varietal, neither of which, in North America, we're not using 6-row in, beer style barleys. We're also not using winter barleys because basically everywhere except for Western Washington, winter barley doesn't really survive. It's too cold in the winter. So this whole conversation started around this varietal, and that happens to be a coincidence, but it happens to be the first edition of Colere this year is using that varietal. Even though we've used 20 different ones, it happened to be this was the first one that we were really, really excited about and wanted to release. So there's kind of something beautiful that's happened there. But the whole idea behind this is to focus on varietal flavor. Now, with varietal flavor, you've got to be a little bit careful. Now, for everybody who's listening, if you're familiar with Westland, you know our use of roasted malts and new oak as well. And the whole idea there is increase the malty part of the whiskey. If you increase the malty part of the whiskey, you can increase oak. So typically you don't find a lot of new oak in single malt. So we're trying to basically make the volume louder on both sides, but still remain balanced. With barley varietal flavor, it's not nearly as loud, quote unquote, as roast flavor. So we've tempered down the oak characteristic as well. So uniquely for a Westland product, actually this will be the first time that a consistent, each edition of Colere, will be different, but it will be an annual style series. At least for the foreseeable future, you won't see any new oak at all. So we're using a mixture of refill Westland casks, casks that we've used once before for our American oak expressions, and refill bourbon casks to achieve that nice level of balance between the barley varietal flavor and the cask flavor.
And I was just going to ask that. And I'm sorry to step on your toes here, Jason, but you said something earlier on which I really loved, and you mentioned it before, but I've been thinking about it this entire conversation, where the common mantra is 70% of your flavor comes from the casks, but that's a choice. And so if you're looking to highlight the flavor of the barley, I was going to ask what the cask style is, because you don't want to hide it, right? One of the beautiful things about bourbon is that you have this lovely whack of, it's these oak-driven flavors, but the biggest problem with bourbon is you can't get yourself out of that box because it's so cask-driven. But so here you're stepping back. So let me ask you, you said you're using a combination of ex-Westland casks and ex-bourbon casks. You use a variety of casks for different Westland products and projects. So do you specify which ex-Westland casks they are and why you use them?
So when I say ex-Westland, what I'm really meaning is the two types of new oak that we would use for virgin American white oak filling. So new American white oak. So what are called the Cooper Select and Cooper's Reserve series from Independent Stave Company. Both air-dried, 18-24 months, number 3 char on one, 24-month air drying, and a light char on the other. So we're taking those, and they're being used for a variety of things. Sometimes they might be peat. The 5-malt recipe, occasionally it might just be pale barley in there. It's kind of a blending tool. But for the most part, what we're getting out of this, and certainly what we wanted to use with Colere, is stuff that all came probably from the 5-malt recipe, just to have some degree of consistency. But we've tried to keep that. It's been interesting because, again, this is it's not a science project. Our goal is to make a really good whiskey and release it. So we try to balance, and I say that like I'm denigrating science, but I'm not. The thing is we're trying very hard to focus on that barley varietal flavor, but also we're trying to make a good whiskey first and foremost, right? So that's the big focus.
Which leads us perfectly to the part that Joshua stepped on my toes just a second ago.
You're welcome.
Josh and I are going to taste this in the next segment of the podcast. But sitting with you today, how do you describe the flavors of Colere, and where do you taste this Alba barley in relation to this wood maturation that you've been in charge of?
Excellent question.
Yeah, so the first way that I would describe it, and I've been able to look at it, and maybe if somebody has, a single cask at home they've purchased from us that was a first fill bourbon, they might be able to roughly compare, like for like. This is 50% ABV, so it's not full cask strength. But in general, what we're finding is there's most of the time in our ex-bourbon cask, there's the bright kind of citrusy fruitiness and citrus peel and stuff like that. This is trending more towards grape fruitiness, and also, it honestly really reminds me of like a white Burgundy. There's just something about, especially the kind of the funkier, white Burgundies that have some degree of, savoriness to them as well. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's not like Napa Chardonnay, but like white Burgundy style, so it has some nuttiness. It has some like gingerbread cake, which is really interesting to it as well. Ooh. So but the whole idea is that it's definitely lighter, it's more elegant than like Gariana, which is, a riot, so Colere is a lot more lighter and a lot more, especially if people are really big fans of refill casks or more traditionally styled whiskeys that come out of Scotland, whereas a lot of our stuff has a lot of new oak. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to kind of hit really nicely for a lot of people. So, but you guys are going to taste it.
We are indeed.
Soon,
I'm really intrigued because years ago when we made the Whiskey Jubilee blend with you, and we had a chance to taste casks of Washington pale malt, it was such a very different style of Westland from what we're used to. And in using Westland in some of my tastings, and I just poured Coldfoot at a tasting the other week, I'm always talking about your 5 malt mash bill, right? I'm always talking about the chocolate malt. I'm always talking about how you're a whiskey distillery for beer lovers. And if you know your barley going in from your beer circles, boy, are you going to love Westland. And so the thought of there being a different string in that bowl is really interesting. And I'm really excited to taste this and to taste this different barley, which is a thing we've been exploring with others as well. So, yeah, I'm really intrigued. And I love seeing this different side of the distillery. With that in mind, in terms of positioning this for the consumer, you've got Gariana, which is wonderful, and an annual release. Now you're introducing Colera, and that will now be an annual release.
It's not cholera, Jason. It's Colere.
So
I tried not to say cholera.
It's Colere.
Colere.
It sounds Irish to me. Colere.
It's Colere. It's the beer, Jason. I think it's plugged up your ears.
Colere.
So Colere. So Colere is part of the Outpost range. So we had Gariana. It was kind of on its own for a while. And what we were doing with Gariana as a way of exploring the Gariana oaks, its own provenance and its own flavor profile, and how it interacts with the rest of Westland's house style. That was a model for what we wanted to do with barley varietals, and eventually get into, that traditional kind of environmental terroir, field-to-field variations, all that other stuff, as well as our project with Solum, which is the local peat with Washington State peat. And the important thing with the Outpost range, these 3 collection of whiskeys, Gariana, Colere, Solum, is that each one is about exploration, about pushing the idea of single malt here in the Pacific Northwest further. And releasing that in whiskey form. So each one is an annual edition style series. Gariana has been released roughly the same time every year since 2016. Colere will be doing the same thing. So Gariana in the fall, Colere in the spring, which we think times really nicely with the barley planting season, as well as just the characteristic of Colere itself as a liquid. And then Solum will join in the winter, in the depth of winter.
Okay.
Which I think works really nicely with peat. So once we get there, which is, year and a half, 2 years away. So
tell us more about Solum.
That's the general idea.
We haven't had you on the podcast in so very long. I haven't spoken with you about Solum. You want to put some leaves on those branches for us?
Yeah, Solum, basically worst kept secret in the whiskey industry. I mean, not like we were really trying to keep it a secret, but, this idea of sourcing peat from Washington State, which again gets tied back to our work with Skagit Valley Malting, going up there, talking to them. We dug up peat in 2011 from this local bog. No malting company in America makes peated malt, or didn't at the time. So, that was that, as much as the barley varietals was the impetus for going up to Skagit Valley and thinking about starting our own malting company and then changing our minds and saying, actually, you guys do it. So that was great. Good decision. So we worked with them, but Solum, I think of the 3 projects, Gariana, Colere, Solum, Solum, I think, is the trickiest because there are people that exist out there in the oak industry. Even if Gariano is a new oak fundamentally to be using, there are coopers in this country, and there are people who know how to use oak, and there's a lot of people who know oak science. Even if our barley varietals are outside the commodity system and they look crazy, they do different things, there's a lot of people who understand barley and its implication on flavor and beer, especially, and sometimes spirits. Peat, there's none of that in this country. None of it.
Yeah.
And so we're very much learning that, all this stuff from the ground up to try to, make a peated whiskey, which is the first time that, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that peated malt has been made commercially by a maltster ever in this country. So
seems like a fair claim. If somebody wants to prove me wrong, I'm happy to. It's not like something it's not like I stand behind it with, if somebody shows me where, I'll correct it. But I haven't heard of anything. I've researched it. I haven't been able to find anything. So we've never needed it as a fuel source in this country. Yeah.
So everything is brand new with this. And so that project started using that peated malt in 2016 and laying down those casks. And the same approach to casks that we're using in Colere is being used in Solum, which is, let's make sure that we're not going to overpower the flavor of the peat. Let's make sure that stands out a little bit. So we're using used casks. That's also meaning longer maturation. So we've been patient with this, despite that it's been 5+ years. We think it's going to be a couple more. Just let it happen naturally. So, that project has been a blast. It's been full of ups and downs. If I'm very honest. We're learning these things. We don't know, this peat is very different from Scottish peat. Like the stuff that grows in the bog is very, very different. There's moss, but there's also lots of, shrub vegetation, deciduous vegetation that grows and drops its leaves in there. It's not, this is not going to be Isla where it's like pure, sphagnum moss decaying into medicinal flavors.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit wilder than that. And you can taste it in some of the samples we've done, the blind tastings we've done internally. So we're at this point now where we're confident in the liquid enough, obviously, to announce the release date. So now we're at this point where we want to talk about, because you guys, we're very transparent. We want to talk about things we do. Mm-hmm. I don't know what Solum Edition 1 is going to taste like. I don't know what the exploration is going to be. Uh-huh. And that's part of the point, is to be transparent about this process. The first time, a kind of full peated whiskey from end to end has been made in this country, to the best of my knowledge. There's been a couple distilleries that have kind of smoked some, previously made malts in-house, which I think is different. That's a technical thing, but different from peating as a task. Yeah. But an end-to-end system here, this is quite new. So we don't know, for example, if Solum is going to be about the exploration within the different areas of the bog at first, different depths of the peat in the bog, or will it be more about, this is roughly what we're getting in this bog, comparing that to other aspects of our house style, kind of like what we're doing with Gariano right now. Mm-hmm. Because we could actually kind of pursue all these different areas of exploration, and we've got to find some runway, So that's the part that we're working on right now, is to say not just what would we do with Solum 1, because that would be kind of easy, but where could we go that would provide a train for everybody to follow, including ourselves, things to explore. So we just wanted to just put that out in the open, because people were going to ask us about it anyway. So might as well talk about
it. So in terms of not knowing necessarily what the flavor profile of number 1 will be, when you've held that peated malted barley in your hand, and you've been using, in the past you've used Highland peated malt, and you've been on Isla, you've been at Bruichladdich, I guess that's Highland peated malt as well, but you've been on Isla, and you've held Isla peated malt in your hand. What characteristics did you get from the peated malt that will go into Solum?
Well, the thing is, we're exploring technique as well. So we haven't used a consistent technique throughout this whole process as we've been making Solum. So there's no consistent, each batch has been slightly different as we're refining the technique and working with the maltster. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I'd be able to say in the malt itself. Yep. And also just because we haven't really settled on like the ideal technique, even if there is such a thing, maybe we'll never settle on that. But generally what I personally have found in tasting the new makes and the stuff that is mature, we did a tasting a couple months ago 20 different samples, blind tasting from the rack houses. And generally what I taste is kind of a peat mezcal mashup.
Oh, wow.
If you want to look at it that way. Now, that's with some things, and some of them are more pronounced than others.
Yeah.
But this is part of, we're still learning. We're still very much trying to get into, why does it taste that way? Is that repeatable? Did we do that? Was that the peat? And so there's just so much there to process that we're still trying to figure out. So what I can say at the moment is that it is different from Scottish peat, which I'm very thankful for, because we do want it to be different. It is what it is, but it's cool that it's different. But I don't. How much of that difference will be magnified in Solum version 1? I don't know yet.
Yeah. Yeah, when you had mentioned it's a mashup between mezcal and peat, that's actually the password to my wallet. So you've nailed it. You've nailed it there. So a couple of things. First off, we're about an hour into the conversation, so I can imagine we want to start winding down in a little bit. We always have a closing question to ask, and of course, I don't want to cut Jason off. And if there's something you wanted to mention, Matt, of course, I want to give you that space. But you had mentioned earlier that at this point, 40% of what you're laying down is this different/unique stuff that has not been not just traditional to the U.S., but not traditional to Westland from where you started, right? And so I'm curious, as you're adjusting what you're laying down, how, if at all, ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, cask 6293. Oh, I have that right here. Right there. I have it somewhere. Hey, there we go. I'm going to pour that too. So I'm wondering, what does that do to your current core range? And do you right now you have a specific distillery characteristic, right? When I taste Westland American oak, right? That's what I use when I want to introduce someone to Westland. I pour that first because, in my opinion, this is you guys putting your foot forward, right? This is us, everybody. If you like it, come explore the rest of the things. So, what is this new production going to do to your core range, and will it affect?
Just
go ahead,
before
Jason.
you finish your question,
go ahead. Step all over me, Jason, please.
You're far too modest to say this, but a couple of episodes ago, Matt, you won't know this at this time, but Joshua and I named 10 whiskies that our listeners, people in whiskey, must have on their shelves. Must have. And one of those 10 was Westland American Oak. That's how important we think that whiskey is. So with that said, that adds to the context of the question being posed by Joshua here.
It does.
No, definitely. The stakes are very much higher. Well, first of all, that's very kind of you to say. And we love American Oak as well. The thing about Westland, I think a lot of people will try to box Westland into a particular flavor profile manifestation. We talk about house style a lot, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of distilleries, they have a house style and it doesn't vary. The constant about Westland is that we are pushing forward, right? The constant, the one thing that is, and this is not a thing you can taste in a house style, but the constant at the core of what Westland is forward motion.
You're like the prog rock of whiskey producers.
Single malt.
Basically.
I guess. Yeah, that's absolutely. So I'm not going to, I can't hang in conversations on prog rock. So I'm not going to fall into that trap.
It's a very small group of people, Matt. It's okay to not be part of it.
There's one guy.
Joshua's got a little puppet he talks to in his basement.
Yeah, there's one guy living in his mom's basement that is loving this part of the conversation right now. Anyway, continue. So
the whole ethos of Westland is that there is possibilities to explore in single malts, and that is manifested in the things that you talked about, Jason, that were fundamental to our house style, whiskey for beer lovers, roasted malts, Belgian yeast, the new American oak. But that has progressed and grown over the past 10 years. Or at least the manifestation of those ideas has progressed and grown. So we're at this point now where we've got to a couple of key decision points. One is a lot of the things that we wanted to do at the very beginning, we had to put these systems into place, like the local peat and these different barley varietals. That takes an immense amount of work, whereas like the roasted malts was off the shelf. It never been really done before. I mean, Stranahan's was before us, and I suppose the Glenmorangie Signet, done before. But there was really no, living knowledge of that. So we have all these things that we've been working on are now kind of in the system and are part of this larger, these are part of our stocks. We're also trying to do a couple of big things. One is we're trying to increase our sustainability initiatives and lower our carbon footprint. And we're also trying to say, and maybe you guys have heard this before, somebody asks the question, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that in terms of innovation? The answer is always, does this further the idea of making single malt in the Pacific Northwest? Yes or no?
Yeah.
And if it's no, then typically we don't do it. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but typically we don't do it. And now we are at a point where we've made a couple of big decisions. One is we've stopped sourcing peated malt from Baird's in Scotland. There's nothing wrong with Baird's peated malt in Scotland. It's amazing from a quality perspective, but we're really happy with what's going on with our own local peat. So that's one thing. The other thing is we've stopped using old sherry wine casks from Spain. Now that has a couple of really big implications. We've been making a lot of whiskey for some time now. So we've got stocks of that available. We've kind of made this decision that we're at a point where Westland, we've got these things with Gariana and Colere and soon to be Solum. And we'll have these things that are rotating throughout the year, 3 new whiskeys every year, constantly. This will be a core part of what Westland is going forward. And I kind of like to think like the Outpost range is very much like, kind of where the heartbeat of Westland is, as we go forward. But there's still so much value, and I really do mean this seriously, in having, a product that is consistent in terms of flavor profile, price point, and everything else like that. So we are actually slowly phasing out the core range in all markets, some sooner rather than later. And we are replacing it with one new SKU. This has not yet been announced, so your listeners will be the first to hear this.
Well,
so
thank you.
This is Westland, just very simply, Westland American Single Malt Whiskey. So this new SKU, this is going to become our new flagship SKU that's going to be out there. Very, very similar to, well, no, it depends. It'll be interesting to have you guys taste it because we've got perceptions on it, but we haven't exposed it to a lot of people yet. The core part of what about Westland's house style is the same here. Roasted malts, Belgian yeast. I mean, everything has been Belgian yeast, new American oak.
Yeah.
We've just got some other tools in the toolkit that we didn't have 8 years ago when we first released American oak that now we're able to deploy, in a new product that will go for an indefinite amount of time. So there's a little bit of Oloroso sherry in the blends, and there's a little bit, I personally think, sub-threshold peat in the blend, about 12%, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So it'll be interesting to see how people taste it. Peat, we've discovered, our blender, Shane, really likes peat at a really low level because it adds an element of spice and a length to the finish that people can't quite quantify, but is there. So we've just that product is just now making its way out to markets around the U.S. We're in kind of stealth mode right now, actually. But this is a really, really exciting, new whiskey for us, kind of all at the same time, right? We've got Gariana, Colere is launching. We've got this new product, that we're putting out that kind of, simplifies the entry points. And if people are really, big fans of our, traditional old sherry casks and our, Scottish peated malt, we still got a lot of that stuff in the warehouse, and we'll release those as single casks, even with you guys, and we'll be able to. I said it, so that commits it. That's an oral contract.
Yay!
So we want to actually boost up our single cask program again, and offer more of that more of that stuff as well. So that's kind of the shift that is coming within Westland.
Wow. That's really interesting. So just to be clear, so you're talking about one standard bottling that will be available consistently, and then 3 annual releases, 1 coming out in the spring, 2 coming out in the fall. And those will be the 4 things
One in the fall.
lovers of Wesley could look for, and then some single casks on top of that. I know you've got your distillery cask program, which we have taken advantage of many, many, many times. Will there be Westland Distillery single cask picks on retail shelves in America or elsewhere?
Yeah, if you mean, our distillery branded.
Yeah.
Single cask? Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of, it allows us to by consolidating the bottom ends, we're able to make, within distribution in the US, there's only so much you can really do, but from experience. There's a lot of complexity involved with managing a bunch of different SKUs, especially if you want to release like a new annual edition, once a year. We're kind of, if I'm honest, like testing the 3-tier system here. It's complex.
Yes, it is.
I don't mean testing in terms of trying to get around it. I just mean like it's to get something in every market at the same time, new edition. It's different from the last edition. We think, there's a lot of similarities to the wine industry. Wait, this is a new vintage, different from the old vintage. But
good point.
Anyways, so to be able to drop that the same, with the Outpost range, that's a lot of logistical heavy lifting, generally speaking. So to be able to do that and have that reliably in retail and with bars and restaurants, and then to be able to deploy single cast or maybe other one-off limited releases per market depending upon what people want. So we take that opportunity as it comes. Actually,
yeah, power to you.
Yeah,
I'm curious, and again, you may not know the answer to this because it might still be in the still to come future. But do you have a sense of the number of bottles involved with, say a Gariana release going forward, a Solum release going forward? Do you have a sense of what that looks like on an annual release?
What I do know is that because we've got a head start with Gariana, we'll be a little bit out ahead of what we're able to do with Colare. I see this popped up just shy of 2,900 bottles for Colare Edition 1. In addition to, we're working on Edition 2 right now. The selection process of that, that'll take some time to get underway. So I think in general, like 50%, we kind of like 5 years from now, let's say 5 years from now, of the 3 of them, 50% of that will be Gariana, and then Colare and Solum will make up the remaining 25 and 25, just by stock limitations alone. But we'll see. It depends on how some markets really, really respond to peat. Like Scandinavia and Japan, they love peat up there. So maybe that becomes a Solum hotspot or something like that. So it's stuff like that we still have to figure out.
That sounds like something you should see your doctor about. If you develop a Solum hotspot.
A Solum hotspot.
Yeah, please see a healthcare professional.
So
I just wanted to see if I could get Matt Hofmann to laugh one more time before we get out of here. So check.
I'm glad I could bring you joy, Jason.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
2 things. I want to correct Jason here because Colare will be in the spring. Gariana will be in the fall. It's not cholera either. It's Colare. Colare.
That's how you pronounce it.
Colare.
Colare. So Colare, thank you, will be in the spring. Gariana will remain a fall release. And Solum, which I think you said, did you say was 2020? Yeah, in the winter time, 2023. Yeah, so that'll be a winter release. So that it won't be 2 fall releases and 1 spring release. It'll be spring, fall, and winter. So I'm just correcting you, Jason.
and Gariana is ideally like late September, early October.
Okay.
There's a good amount of space in there. Okay. So basically 4 months apart for each one, right?
Look at
3
you.
whiskeys 4 months apart.
It's all planned and shit.
So I feel as if we spent the majority of the episode answering our final question, which is, what are you most excited for looking forward? And so let me flip it a little bit. What do you see as potential obstacles moving forward, and and do you see some opportunities to overcome them? Like these are big stories you're telling. So I imagine one obstacle may be a bit of education. What are the other things you see that you need to do to make all of these new projects the success that it will become?
First thing would be to get rid of whiskey tariffs to Europe, I suppose. I don't know if that counts, but those are supposed to double in June to 50% tariff.
No.
I just heard that. Just heard that. Yep.
That's brutal. Oh. So that aside, which is not up to us, it's out of our control. I mean, what we're talking about here, especially with Caleri is one of, if not the most significant whiskeys we've ever made. And I don't mean that in terms of flavor profile or one's better than the other. That's how do you do that anyway? The point is what it means for us in terms of how we look at the fundamental building block of single malt, which is barley.
Yeah.
And even ourselves, we're still using commodity barley, and we're making some, big improvements to that. We're going to be using 100% sustainable agriculture by 2025.
Wow.
So there's some big changes that are happening there. But even in the meantime, what we're talking about, I made the comparison to like age statements and stuff like that earlier. There's a lot of people for whom Westland doesn't make sense because we don't play like the typical single malt age statement. The distilleries, the line arms are this angle, we have all that stuff and all that stuff is there, but we're just talking about fundamentally different things. So we're really pushing that here. However, anytime that we've talked about this project we've been working on in the Skagit Valley, because we haven't been shy about talking about it either, because it's super exciting, every time everybody's just been blown away and stoked by it. So now we finally have a product coming from that region and of that work that we've been doing. So we are hopeful that that's kind of on its way up. But there is definitely a big challenge there, because for as much as we're already, countercultural in whiskey, we're doing that, and I don't mean that in like a punk rock, in a prog rock sort of way.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Nice.
Getting into dangerous waters here.
Retreat.
But retreat.
Keep going.
But we're really, we're not slowing down. And that's, we're not focus grouping things. We're not, looking at Instagram trends. We are making whiskey that we believe in and there's no precedent for. And that is a risky proposition, and it will take a lot. Frankly, it will take a ton of hard work. For as much as, you guys have been super supportive and you guys get it, and a lot of your listeners get it, there's a lot more people out there who are still learning about whiskey or who, this doesn't fit their idea of whiskey, and that's okay. There's plenty of whiskey fish in the whiskey pond. So, what we're trying to do is just continue to build this narrative around this is what whiskey can be, and can we get people to get that light bulb moment where it goes off. So I don't see more as challenges. It's just more like, it's just going to be, a lot of fun work, but hard work.
Sure.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There could be fun in pushing water uphill. You find those little successes, right? Where you're educating people. And I think you made an excellent point, right? There's something so magical in witnessing an aha moment. Right? It's just, okay, they get it, right? And then you move on. You've pushed water up that hill. Let's move to the next hill. Yeah. Yeah,
we live for that stuff. That's been true for Westland since we started our business. But now we're at this point where the aha moment is becoming much bigger, and the implications ripple beyond Westland. We get into conversations about agriculture. We get into conversations about farming. Just the stakes are a lot higher. And, again, we're learning all this stuff at the same time, too. So it just prompts these questions to which we may not have answers yet. And I just, I think there's a certain type of whiskey consumer. I think there's more of them all the time. I truly do, who have intellectual curiosity and love the idea that this category is not, a dead, category made the same way for 200 years, but is a living, breathing, dynamic thing that we're all very passionate about. And that's who this whiskey is for.
Oh, that's the perfect. That's the mic drop.
That is the mic drop. Well, Matt, thank you so much. This has been fun and just a wonderful way to catch up, but really enlightening. And there's certain episodes that I go back to listen to our guest and learn and re-educate myself. And the Matt Hofmann ones are always ones where I kind of go back to more often than the others. So I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, thanks both. It's a pleasure. Really, anytime.
Thanks ever so much to Matt. As we said leading into that, what a catch-up. You know, you could tell by the conversation that we haven't been traveling. Yeah. We haven't been in Seattle. We haven't been in the distillery. We haven't been bumping into Matt at festivals around the country. You know, it's...
or on island.
It really showed. Yeah, right? Right. Yeah. It really showed. And I feel much better about my Westland knowledge and my Westland experience, having got to sit down and just cover the bases and get caught up. And it is interesting the way he talks about where the special editions will lie. Mm-hmm. You know, 3 annual special editions. Then casks, individual casks being for release at the distillery. Mm-hmm. And then a single American single malt product as an OB representing them. And so it gives you 4 things of a year to move among. And then, of course, if you can get to Seattle, if you know somebody in Washington State, there's some additional wrinkles there. So it's an interesting approach.
It is, and I'm hoping that it allows them to tighten up their story a little bit to the American consuming. Well, actually, I take that back. Not just to the American consuming public, but I would say to the rest of the world as well. Again, if most people, when they think of America, think of bourbon and rye, they're going to be 100 miles off base when it comes to Westland, right? And I'm always thinking about how Westland has to tell their story, and so I'm hoping that them culling down the line a little bit, getting a bit more focused on how they're putting their brand forward. Hopefully, that'll help them to educate. Not get around the story, but get ahead of the story separately, because we both have this colliere.
This reminds me, we might have said this on the podcast before. You know, it is season 5, but when you and I went to Italy with our wives for my brother's wedding, and we landed in Rome. We started driving, and we'd flown overnight, and we'd landed first thing in the morning, and we were all kind of bleary-eyed, and we needed some coffee
desperately
to get us up into Tuscany, which, you know, foie. And we stopped essentially at a service station, right? Right, where you walk in, and it was so brilliant because, God bless you. You took charge of the situation, and we pushed you forward to be the one making the order. You seem to have this, white man confidence about you.
Well, it wasn't just the confidence of a middle-aged white man. It was the confidence of a middle-aged white man with Google at his fingertips, right? And so we get to the counter, and obviously we need coffee, but we're also hungry. We had what was it going to be, 4 hours of driving ahead of us? From Rome to
Tuscany,
yeah. And I was trying to think of the name of the town. What was the name of the town? Lucca. Bagna de Lucca. That's it, Bagna de Lucca. Which you could tell by my perfect pronunciation.
Native. Oh, gosh. So native.
And so, so that's the 4 of us. And we, we're all vegetarian. And the only thing that was immediately available sandwich-wise was caprese sandwiches. Caprese. And I didn't know how to say 4, and I didn't think that there's no way it could be like what Spanish is, where you say cuatro. It's got to be something else. So I just looked, how to say 4 in Italian, and maybe I put in the wrong search or whatever, but I looked at this word. And it had this kind of like chevron over the O or something. And I said, okay, I'm going to say this word, but I need to say it in an Italian accent. And so with my phone in hand, I say to the guy, I'm assuming his name is Giuseppe. And I say to him, Giuseppe, I would like caprese sandwich. And he says, quanto, or something like that. And I said, four. And he gives me this confused look, and he turns to the guy making sandwiches in the back, and he says, quattro caprese. Four.
But the way you're pronouncing this whiskey name, like you've just adopted this rogue accent again, and you just own it, just say it. Colere. Fora caprese. Oh gosh, you were, and there was literally a second and a half where you thought you were king of the world.
I still feel like I'm king of the world.
Oh, to have the confidence of a middle-aged white man.
So let me say what I was going to say. When I poured the Calare, and I'm nosing it, and just again thinking about how Westland will be telling their story, right? This is a new approach to the Westland story. All of that aside, like them telling their story, every time I put my nose into a Westland glass, it reminds me that there are few distilleries I am this excited about.
That's a nice point.
Right?
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Their approach to whiskey making, their intention to make it stand apart from the rest. There's always something new and different. And again, so obviously it's an American whiskey. And I say this every time we talk about Westland, but I feel as if it's beyond an American whiskey. It's in that sandbox, that silo of world whiskey. And when it comes to the silo of world whiskeys, there are a few distilleries that excite me more than Westland. I just love what they do and how they do it and their intention behind it.
Yeah, I was intrigued going into this sample because you've got me saying to Matt, I really love the Westland signature 5 malt mash bill.
Yeah.
I love the inclusion of that chocolate malt. I love the presence of the oak. And you've got Matt saying, okay, we didn't do any of those things in this release. It's a 6-row winter barley called Alba, grown in the Skagit Valley. Yeah. It's in refill, some of our refill barrels, where we have matured Westland in them. I do have the website open, and I love, again, the transparency, right? Cask types. Second fill ISC Cooper's Reserve. That makes up 62% of this. And first fill ex Bourbon makes up 38% of this. So you do have that first fill component. Yeah. Again, familiar with out of Scotland. But then also these Westland second fill casks coming around again. And you had made this point before we'd started recording here, is even though it's a different grain bill, and even though the cask types and the maturation are slightly different, there's still Westland at the heart of this. And for you, it was the yeast.
Yeah.
The yeast is still consistent in here for you.
100%. And this is why I think yeast is such an important part of the conversation that thankfully here in the U.S., we've been talking about yeast for years. distilleries have proprietary yeast strains, etc. The Scots are now starting to talk about different yeast. We know that Kilchoman are playing around, and some other distilleries are playing around with yeast. Dr. Bill Lumsden talked about playing around with wild yeast and so on. And yeah, if Westland is known for their 5-grain mash bill and is known for, I wouldn't necessarily say they're known for specific cask types, at least in my head, but I think that 5-grain mash bill really stands out as saying, hey guys, this is what Westland is about, just like Penderyn using a Faraday still says, hey guys, this is what Penderyn is about. When you take away the 5-grain mash bill, what are you left with if you don't have a consistency of casks? You've got the yeast. And nosing it, I don't get that immediately. I'll go over my tasting notes in a second, but it's upon tasting it. When you get the liquid across your tongue, that's when you say, all right, there's that Westland fruitiness. That banana note is still there, and it gets back to the Jean-Claude Van Damme yeast strain.
When I first nosed it and then tasted it, and yeah, that brightness, that juicy fruit gum right across the palate. It's so luxurious. But also, in turning in the glass, there's really good oils in there, wonderful texture on the mouth. But it made me think of the Washington malt that was a component, and I think it was the Washington malt in the Wild Turkey barrel for the maturation, that was a component of the Whiskey Jubilee Westland that we did.
Correct.
And then after we did the deconstructed tasting before one of the the New York Jubilee, we heard from Bino, we heard from Matt Lurin, we heard from Michael Nolan, other Nation members. If you bottled this Washington malt, we would buy it. And we bottled the remains of the cask. We didn't have a lot. I think we were under 150, 140 bottles at that time. It was 103
bottles, I think.
Really?
I'm near positive it was 103.
Memories.
Anyway.
And so we bottled the remainder of it, but it was known for being so bright. I often talked about it as liquid sunshine in the glass. And the brightness that I get from the Colera is outstanding, absolutely outstanding.
So give me some notes. Let's go on the nose here. And we don't normally do this, and I want to be very clear here. We're not. This is not an infomercial for Calare or anything. We've got the samples. I just want to know what you got going on here.
There's something tropical fruit. Is it a mango? Is it a pineapple? But it's bright and rich and warm and syrupy.
It's Meyer lemons. It's honeydew. There's a little bit of like persimmon tartness going on in the background there. I just sniffed the mic. I pulled my glass away from my nose and then I sniffed the mic. Realized, wait a second, that's not. What do you get on the mic? What do you get on the nose of the mic there?
Yeah, it's very Mikey. Very Mikey. Unmistakable.
Yeah.
Hint of foam.
Yeah, a hint of foam. A hint of.
Oh, it's funny. You talk about leading the witness. I talk about foam and then I stick my nose back into this glass. I get foam bananas.
Oh, yeah.
I know we've talked about foam bananas
Yes,
on some Scotch single malts.
Yep. And this was the other thing that I wanted to mention. Now, this barley is a 6-row Alba, I think you said it was called. I was trying to think of what this whiskey reminded me of, and it reminded me of this 2006 beer barley Bruichladdich bottling that I have, and it was Isla barley from the Kinnegary farm. And beer barley is also a 6-row barley, isn't it?
That's the type of question that would need some research.
We can edit.
Beer, barley, 6-row. Let's see if that gets a result. Beer barley is a 6-row landrace crop cultivated across Orkney by landrace maintainers in small sections of land on crofts.
There you go.
Well done, Joshua.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, leave all of that in. Yes, we can discover that in real time.
So isn't that interesting that this Alba beer barley, I shouldn't call it beer barley, but this Alba 6-row barley has, in my opinion, similar fruity, bright, citrusy notes that this Bruichladdich beer barley has. So I think in a way that helps to prove what the folks at Westland are looking for. Does barley play a part in that final flavor, in that final
Right.
product? And I don't think it's a stretch to say, yeah, I think it could. Hold on.
Yeah, you think so?
I've got the bottle here. I'm gonna pop that open and just smell from the bottle. Yeah, bright, lemony, a bit saltier. There's a bit of a salty component in here.
Okay.
And Bruichladdich always has that subtle lactic acid, that kind of milky thing going on, that makes it Bruichladdich, but that bright citrusy, you can't even avoid it if you tried kind of note is here as well as in this Kalari.
Yeah, I'm with the internet open here. I'm going back over the tasting notes from Westland, and just on the nose, I won't go into the palate just yet, but on the nose, roasted pineapples commingle with a floral character. And then this is straight out the Joshua Hatton toolbox.
Oh yeah.
With life cereal. And it doesn't stop there. Grape soda. Like, you and your cereal notes, you and your grape soda notes. Like, I think of you when I see those two things happening. It then goes on to say cookie dough and roasted almond notes.
Interesting.
Yeah, roasted almond isn't normally something I think of.
Yeah, I'm not getting that. For me, it's on those fresh, juicy, fruity notes. And across the palate, on my third sip, across the palate, and I know you haven't had this, but I talked about this in our episode with Arik Torin of Fidencio, where I got to taste pulque down in Oaxaca, right? That fermented agave drink. And it has that agave juicy sweetness coming through across the palate.
Yep. I will say, though, I have had crema de mezcal, which has, to my understanding, pulque with the mezcal.
Oh, interesting.
And brings it down. Yeah. Yeah, really, really good. And it's funny because it does remind me of the mezcal that we bottled in collaboration with Arik.
There you go.
It's got this kind of rich, buttery kind of quality to it.
Okay.
So before I finish my pour over here, palate notes.
So
I'm perilously close to the end of this pour.
So again, I got pulque on the palate. Let me go back in. Before I even talk about notes, the texture is so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just rolls on your tongue. It looks like you got some notes. Go ahead.
Well, for me, it's that Wrigley's juicy fruit gum. Really, it's really sweet, but not cloyingly so, right? It's more like that exuberance of putting a fresh stick of juicy fruit into your mouth.
Wow. Okay.
But then the wood starts to appear towards the back of the palate, but it's not that usual big framing wood from Westland. It's much more the soft pepper, like that ground grey pepper that I sometimes talk about in our own tasting notes for Single Cask Nation. It's a quiet counterpoint as it quietly dissipates.
Oh, two notes hit me simultaneously. Lemon pound cake and unlit cigars, right? That fresh cigar wrapper thing going on.
And that fresh cigar wrapper, that unlit version of it, is very close to my ground grey pepper.
Okay.
Where
There
it's an echo in the background, and I hear you 100% on that note. I think the lemon pound cake speaks to, of course, the citrus, right, that continues to run through this, but also the butteriness. The weight, the texture. Westland themselves say the pineapple headlines a fruity palate with original wheat thins, black pepper, and fig bar, with gingerbread cake driven by the malt. That's interesting. For me, and I don't tend to get the gingerbread cake in this one, but gingerbread notes tend to come from the wood rather than the malt. But I assume they've tasted the malt as is.
Well, I mean, right, tasting notes are incredibly subjective, and what did you have for breakfast? What did I have for breakfast? That's going to affect our tasting notes. I'm a bit confused by the fig bar note. I wouldn't focus on the fig there. I would fig on the breading, the cookie breading on the outside rather than the fig.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, no, it's kind of like a fig Newton, right? Where do you really think about the figs when you're eating a fig Newton, or are you really just thinking about the outside coating?
Right, and especially if you're eating a fig Newton properly, you go along the edges and you bite the cookie coating on either side, so then you have 4 sides of exposed fig, and then you eat that. That's how you do it.
My kids don't get beaten for a lot of things. That's one of the things they get beaten for.
For doing the right thing?
Yeah. doing the right thing, he says.
Jesus, I'm scared what you'll do to them when you watch them eat Oreo cookies.
That's the other place the beatings. I have to say this, just very quick aside. My 14-year-old picked up some triple stuffed Oreos at the weekend.
No one does that.
Right?
You don't.
Right?
People don't do double stuff. If you do triple stuff, you're a broken person.
Horrific. Absolutely horrific.
The ratio's off.
It's, oh my God. Oh,
Oreos,
sorry for bringing that up.
Oreos are great for a reason. The ratio of single stuff to 2 chocolate cookies, it's perfect.
See, to be honest, it's still too much. Single is too much for me. It's too sweet. I need more cookie to offset just how. You want to talk about cloyingly sweet an Oreo is? Oof, that's tough. Triple. I really thought I was going to be sick after I had the triple. Just to close out on the Calera here, we've got total number of bottles is just under 3,000. Cask maturation, 49 months. And that's for the batch. So a minimum of 49 months for the batch. And then bottled at 50% alcohol, which makes us happy.
See, I feel like,
if you're trying to do the math there, it's 4 years and 1 month.
Thank you. I feel like I'm trying to decipher what proof means.
Yeah. 4 times 12, remainder 1.
How old are your kids, Jason?
14 and 11.
Okay, so 11. So that's like 124 months old. Is that right?
Nope.
Yes, it is.
It's 10 times 12 plus 12
Yeah,
is not 124.
I know.
Do you though? Do you? Let's get back to what you do know. We were lucky to get another sample from Westland that coincided beautifully with the conversation we'd had with Matt. And our assumption is it's okay to taste this in the podcast. And we're certainly going to press ahead and taste it in the podcast. And see if Westland asks us not to taste it in the podcast.
He's 132 months old, by the way. I just did the math on my calculator.
Wow. I got nothing.
I'm really excited to be tasting this. So as Matt mentioned in the podcast, and it's funny that we're getting this news just a few episodes after I suggested their current American single malt is a must-have on your shelves, they're doing
And
away with it.
That's exactly why I wanted to taste this on the podcast. Because, you making that comment, us catching up with Matt and finding out that the thing that you recommended in the top 10 is going away. Mm-hmm. And I thought you would be the person to taste this with, to see if this gets the Hatton seal of approval.
So let's think about really quickly what their old lineup was. There were 3 bottlings in their core range: American single malt, then the sherry wood, and then the peated. And this new version of American single malt has the 5 malt blend plus a bit of sherry wood plus a bit of peated. So it's almost as if they took those 3 bottlings and made this, this hybrid whiskey to show all aspects of what Westland could do. And so let's see what it's like on the nose. The peat is noticeable, and the peat marries a bit with the sweet sherry note on it. It's all delicate, though. There's
I'd
nothing.
agree with that.
I don't think there's anything like jumping out at you, trying to take. There's nothing leading the race, as I should say.
No, but something has caught my attention right off the bat.
And
wonderful oils in the glass.
Yeah.
Absolutely tremendous. Those are heavy oils. Gosh.
Are you getting
the label that we've got on the samples here is just kind of a handwritten label. Oh, there. Look at that. I've turned it around and I've got the answer to my question. 46% alcohol.
Yeah. Yep. As that was expected. I think you mentioned it would be 46%. If not on the recording, just in passing.
I'm just surprised to see such heavy oils on 46%. I actually wondered if they'd sent us a cask strength batch here.
Oh, interesting.
Not that the nose suggests cask strength in any way, shape, or form, but those oils, just like natural oil straight from the cask.
Are you getting much of the 5 malt in here? Are you getting that chocolate coming through?
Like a little bit, but I think your point from a moment ago stands up, where as you explore it with your nose, you're getting a little bit of the sherry sweetness.
Yeah.
You're getting a little bit of the peat smoke. I'm definitely getting a little bit of chocolate, but I'm also almost getting a chocolate cherry happening on the nose here.
Like the chocolate cherries you get at the gas stations. You pay the 25 cents. It's right at the counter. You talking that kind of chocolate cherry?
Sure.
Do you not buy one at every gas station you frequent?
I don't know.
There you go. Now that you've said it, though, I can't unsmell that.
Right. But I think the general point is the balance of the nose.
Yeah. It's really, really well balanced and interesting, right? This is Westland now putting a new foot forward, and it's saying, yes, we got a bit of peat in us. Yes, we got a bit of sherry in us. Yes, we got some roasted malt there for you. This is kind of like the jack of all trades kind of whiskey here, like the all rounder, right? Remember Highland Park 12. That was always the all-rounder. If you wanted a bit of smoke, a bit of sweet, a bit of malt, a bit of salt, right?
I had to take my first sip of this while you were chatting away there.
Oh, boy.
The peat's more present on the palate. And it's almost, I'm not used to this with Westland, but it's almost a medicinal style peat on the palate. Are you getting the same thing?
I am. It's not that like fragrant smoke on the palate. It is that medicinal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's got the hospital beds. It's got the fresh bandages. But it's to the back of the palate. It's not to the front. The front has got a very delicate sweetness happening.
Yeah. For me, I agree with you. The sweetness is up front. That peatiness, though, that slightly medicinal peatiness, is right mid palate for me, and the chocolate starts to kick in after you swallow. You get that finish coming through, that chocolate depth. There's a depth there. There's a richness there, or a heaviness there, that I think may be amplified by that lingering peat. Does this seem...
I wouldn't mind...
Go ahead.
I wouldn't mind a bit more wood to transition from mid-palate to finish.
What do you think's lacking there? Other than wood, like what do you think more wood would be doing?
Just a bit more framing of the sweetness into the peat, then into some heavier wood, then into the finish. Because I'm getting a little bit of the pepper that we talked about previously, where there is that pepper to the back of the palate transitioning into the finish.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. However, okay, let me dig a little deeper. Let me try to clarify my question. When you say you're looking for that wood, what type of wood would you want? Are you looking for more influence from an ex-bourbon, from an ex-sherry cask, or maybe from a new charred oak?
The new charred oak.
Right. And see, I am glad that's not there. Because I really want Westland to do all they can to show that they are not a bourbon, that they are not a rye, and that new charred oak note. Not most, but many bourbons, when you taste them, the notes are very oak driven, right?
Sure. Sure.
And so I want Westland to show that point of difference. I like that they're staying separate.
So let me counter you with this then.
All right.
Westland as a world single malt, to my mind, not enough Scottish single malts are leading with new charred oak. Westland could be in a position to have a world single malt. And I'm not saying have as much as bourbon has, but just put it in the back there. Just allow it to be a transitional item. You've got so many things going on here, and there's so much balance that I think the one additional thing from my palate that would add to the balance would be a little bit more of the oak.
All right.
And it doesn't need to be either bourbon or sherry, but it needs to be oak. That's what I would like.
Right, and here's one of the beautiful things about a new cask is, and you mentioned them before when we were talking about Colare, that they're using ISC casks, Independent Stave Company casks. I imagine if they wanted a bit more oak like you're suggesting, however, at the same time wanting to not come across as a bourbon with those massive oak notes, you could do a toast with a very light char, something like that. They could just add just that little extra layer that I think you're looking for. I don't think it's missing anything personally, and the more I sip it, I like their approach. I will miss that old American single malt, but I like this approach of them presenting an all-rounder, which I think was such a big key to Highland Park's success, that so many people could come to it for many different reasons, even if you're okay with a little bit of smoke, if you're okay with a little bit of sherry, right? This seems to be taking that approach, and I like it.
Well, and I think if you're Westland, if you're Remy, and you're thinking, okay, what's our entry OB product? Could a consumer who understands that product or who has been introduced to that product, could they jump from there and explore our 3 annual releases and better understand the distillery? I think the answer is yes. And I think, as we said on the nose here, hey, we do peat here. There's also an annual peat release. We do, single malt barley here. We've also got one of those in an annual release.
Yeah.
And then we also do something with, what's the other one? What they do? They're doing a peated one. They're doing annual
Gariana
grain. And Gariana, right? The oak,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Right. And we've got one that's the Oregon oak. And so, I think this sets the table beautifully for the 3 jumping off points. And then, as we said way back in the beginning, if you can get the distillery, if you know somebody in the state of Washington, really play around with those single cask picks. Or, if you know an independent bottler who's got a relationship with Westland.
Do you feel as if with this new American single malt and Westland eliminating their old American single malt, replacing it with this that seems to be, again, that combination of the 3 old bottlings, right? American single malt, sherry, and then peated. Do you feel as if they've lost their calling card, and people will perceive it that way, or do you believe that this is an enhancement of their calling card? And let me give you some examples. In the mid-90s, Glengarry went from a peated malt to an unpeated malt. A distillery changing the house style is not unheard of. In the mid-90s, Glenmorangie did the same thing, right? They had Dr. Jim Swan help with reworking their spirit, and they started working with finishes and things like that. And so my point is, distilleries have done this. And so do you see this as them doing something similar to what Glengarry and Glenmorangie did? And are you, just as a drinker, pleased with this new calling card?
I think, simply put, we're witnessing the evolution of a distillery. And one of the things that has always excited me about Westland, the same thing that excited me about Kilchoman, is that we could be there for the journey. And as you talk about the changes made at Glengarry and those made at Glenmorangie, and you could throw in the changes made at Ardmore and moving away from coal-fired stills there, in the very early 2000s. We only got a portion of the distillery before that in our own personal histories.
Yeah.
Here we are, every step of the way with Westland. And it's funny because, Matt doesn't often talk about it just because it's so far in the past now, but they started out with what do you call in America, right? A lock-up in an industrial estate, right? A sliding shutter door, right?
Yeah, it's a little rent-a-space kind of thing, yeah.
Right. And they started
self-storage.
And I almost feel bad that we missed out on those early days, even though when we first met Matt and Westland and went out to Hoquam where they were maturing spirit, we got to taste the early experiments, right? And so here we are now in 2021. This is the foot that Westland is putting forward to represent them. And I think it is a terrific foot. And I think it's one worth getting to know. And then it brings me back to my point earlier, which is, as a consumer, you can go from American single malt into 3 annual releases and further explore. And it's interesting because given the way you phrased your question, I almost think the 3 annual expressions become the calling card. That's the way in which Westland says, this is who we are. But you got to get to know them through the American single malt first.
Maybe. I don't see it that way.
Can you think of Westland without thinking of Gariana Oak?
That's a very good point. That is a very good point. You cannot think of Westland without thinking of Garyana oak. However, these annual special releases are at a much higher price point. And for those people, again, when you and I talk and when our listeners listen to our podcast, we're all in a somewhat similar boat of we're a bit more in the know than your average bear. And so we know Garyana. Our listeners know Garyana. And if they didn't know Garyana until today, now you know. Westland has a release called Garyana where they're using this special Garyana oak that's only available in the Pacific Northwest. And it's a very different style of whiskey. Anyway, my point is, for those that don't really know Westland, this new American single malt, which is at a slightly lower price point than the old one, which that's kind of good. I think that's going to be your calling card because it's the lowest barrier to entry to the brand. If you don't know anything about Westland and you're at a shop and you see one bottle for I'm just going to pull a number out of the sky, $150. And I think the Calare is more on their website, but that's because there's Washington state taxes involved there and all that. Anyway, if you see a special edition for $150 and then you see their standard for $65 or $60, whatever the price is, you'd say, let me go for that one first. I've heard about that, right? So that, I think price point is going to dictate their calling card. I think this is the
So
calling
not for the
card.
first time, not for the first time you and I are using words differently. So for me, calling card sounds more like distillery DNA, right? Like, how do you know who we are? And I feel like the American single malt is the beginning of a relationship. Mm-hmm. This is the part of the relationship where you don't yet fart in one another's company, right?
This is
where
first base. That's what it is. This first base.
Right. This is hello, how are you? Good to meet you. You've got some qualities that I find intriguing. Let me get to know you better. Mm-hmm. And then you say, holy shit, you've got Garyana oak. I think I might love you. Oh, you've got, Skagit Valley grown grain in refill Westland barrels. I think I might have to marry you, right? I think it's the growing relationship. And then you pull out the peat. Well, gosh. Yes, This is going to be a long, fruitful marriage. But for you, calling card seems to be the intro.
Yes.
Hello, how's your father?
Yes, 100%. For me, that's calling card. This
is would you swipe right? I have literally no idea if right is the good one or the bad one, but it's intended to be the good one. If I'm using that incorrectly, I apologize.
Yeah, swiper, no swiping. Swiper, no swiping. Swiper, no swiping. Yeah, to me, a calling card is, you're the vacuum salesman. You come to a door and you're in the 50s and you say, hey, was your husband around? I want to sell you a vacuum cleaner, because this is what they did in the 50s. And no, he's not around. Can you come back? And you say, here you go. Here's my calling card. So they can call you back, right? Hey.
I love the fact I'm trying to make it a 21st century thing with the Tinders. And you're in 1950s vacuum sellers. You do have an onion on your belt. There is no doubt about it.
Hey there, missus. Is your husband around? I got a vacuum to sell. It's really good. It sucks up things and it goes right in the bag.
See, for me, I'm thinking more calling card like the Joker at the end of the first Christopher Nolan movie, where you see the Joker's calling card and you think, oof, this is about to get real, right? There's something to unpack here. That's what I thought you were meaning by calling card earlier.
And I like what you just said. I like a lot what you just said, because I think what you just said talks about this whiskey that we have in our glass now. There is a lot to unpack here. It gets back to that all-rounder. That's why I call this a calling card. You can explore this and discover new flavors. The more you go back to it, the more I sip, the more that's going on.
But it's that exploration that you and I are differing on. Whereas you're seeing exploration within this dram, and I'm seeing exploration of the distillery.
Yes.
Because I like what this dram has brought to my door, but I want to know more. I want to go and explore further.
What's our favorite GIF?
DNA.
Why not both?
Why not both?
Why not both?
Well, we have spent a long time on these two samples, and it has been a ton of fun. This is exactly what you and I would have been doing at the distillery with Matt, with Steve, in person. And we haven't because of the conditions. So getting to do it on the pod while thinking about the two of them and thinking about our next trip out to Seattle and all the various friends we have in Seattle who we haven't seen in a while.
Yeah.
It's been nice. It's been really nice living in that space for a bit. And that's
Beautiful.
why we've hung out here for a while. So I think listeners want to know if this is the American single malt that's replacing the one that was in your top 10 list. Is it still an endorsement here?
That's a very good question. I really like. I'll be very honest. I'm going to miss that old representation of American single malt, and I'm going to have to go out and buy a few bottles so I don't run out because I will miss it. Is this the perfect replacement? I would say no, it's not a perfect replacement. And it's not because it's a bad whiskey. I think it's a fantastic whiskey. But I think it's showing you so much in one little dram. And one of the things that I enjoyed about the American single malt, it was just a little easier than this. You got to use your brain here a bit more. And I'm not deducting points. I don't look at it that way. It's just two different animals.
And that's what I was going to throw in here is it's not intended to be a replacement for American oak. It's a replacement for the line. And the line is American oak and sherry wood and peated. And is it a replacement for the line? Yes. Is it successful in that regard? Yes. Is it the American oak that you love and cherish? No.
No, but
I think that's no but.
But what this whiskey allows me to do is something I wasn't able to do previously with any standard Westland bottling. If you wanted to tell the Westland story, you had to do it across 3 bottlings. Now you've got the one. The story becomes a bit simpler to tell because it's all locked within that one dram. That's kind of cool. And so thinking about bringing people over, because now we're all getting vaxxed and we're all starting to live in a new world, I'm able to pour this and say, check out Westland. Look at what they're doing now. And you can really spend your time focusing on that singular dram and where that takes you across an hour or two of conversation.
Well, and I know the first thing I'm going to do when this is officially released is I'm going to pour it next to the American oak. And I'm going to do that side-by-side comparison to see where the American oak lives in this new expression.
Yep, 100%. 100.
There we go. Thanks to our friends at Westland for sponsoring this segment of the podcast.
They did.
For the simple price of 2 sample bottles. Gosh, we're cheap.
Yes.
We're so cheap.
And easy. Do we have any news to share? I know we've got an email to share with people, but we have a bit of news to share.
We do have an email. I would love to cycle back on some news. So let's make it official. Let's wake up the paperboy.
Extra, extra! Read all about it. Life story of Playboy Penny. Extra, extra! Extra, extra! Read all about it. Me and that Playboy in trouble.
In the early to middle portion of May, we announced the lottery for the 2 wild turkey casks. Mm-hmm. We had a tremendous response. As always, far more people sign up for the chance of winning than can possibly ever win. But hopefully it's fun to feel like you're in the running for some period of time. The newsy segment of this, the newsworthy part of this, is that in the past, when we've run the lottery, we've then emailed winners and they've had 24 hours to purchase a bottle. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has, and then we move on to another round of winners. And, they don't quite get a guarantee, but they have a chance if they move fast enough. And if not everybody moves on that, we have another round. Mm-hmm. For the first time ever, everybody jumped on their lottery winnings. It was absolutely remarkable to see. And those who have hung around with us for a few years and seen a few of these lotteries have had a chance to see multiple announcements. And this time was kind of one and done. And I'm curious to see, if the history of the nation is anything to go by, this is the new normal. You win, you purchase, there's no future rounds.
I'll tell you from a logistics standpoint, it's made our lives a bit easier.
100%, yep.
and I one of the things that makes me happy about this, even though I'm sad for those that have been waiting for a second round and a third round, I'm excited from a logistical standpoint that, I know some people missed out because maybe an email went into their spam or maybe they were traveling. Think about this. This lottery happened during a time when no one's traveling. So more people had access, consistent access to their emails. Whatever logistically made this work out so that it was a one and done rather than waves 2 and 3, I'm happy for that. And is this a new normal? Perhaps. So moving forward, if you enter a lottery and you get an email that says you won, just do what you did for those winners.
Well, and the consistent message we've sent out to people coming into the info account or on Facebook or on the social medias is there will be more Single Cask Nation Wild Turkey lotteries. And so you might not have won this time, know that boy, are they popular. We see such spikes in membership in the run-up to these. Like, there's such enthusiasm around these. But keep your eyes open. We'll continue to announce it on the podcast. We're trying to get back down to Kentucky now that vaccinations are in place, now that travel is starting to open up again. We're trying to get back down to Kentucky to make more selections. 100%. We know the demand is there. Yep. So that's been really exciting on the Wild Turkey. I do want to double back. We announced on the podcast 2 Westlands, and we briefly described the 2 Westlands. And if this is an industry podcast where we are transparent and we do give our listeners regular peeks behind the curtain, there is a less than savory peek behind the curtain that I want to give right now as an update that is an ongoing situation. And so I'm not saying, the update I'm about to give is not an end of proceedings. And we hope it's not the end of proceedings.
Sure as fuck better not be. Sorry, go on, Jason. Please, continue.
For the first time in our 10-year history, whiskey has gone missing. And in transporting Westland from Seattle to our bottling hall in Kentucky, it's gone missing.
Yep.
And it didn't get delivered on the date it was supposed to. It's somewhere out there. We're now 4 or 5 weeks.
We're 5 weeks into that shipment being completely lost. 2 casks of Westland somewhere. Not at our bottling hall. Not in bottle. Somewhere.
Not at the distillery.
Not at the distillery.
So it's in the interest of transparency. Our listeners are smart enough, savvy enough, and they remember things when we don't. The fact that we mentioned the Westlands, normally we try not to mention things until they're en route, We try not to mention things until there's a bottling date, a delivery date. We had those things. And now what we don't have is the whiskey. So we will keep you updated, dear listener. Know that we have no idea what this situation looks like or how it resolves itself or what happens next. We're speaking to the shipping company. We're trying to get answers. We're spinning our wheels here.
Yeah, we're speaking.
But you
to
might
them.
not hear us mention Westland for a little while.
Yeah.
Or at least our casks, the 2 7-year-olds that we had mentioned previously.
Yeah. It's infuriating. I wake up every day looking at my email. Do we have good news? No, we have no news. Okay, I will email them again. What's going on? How can we escalate this? Why isn't this your entire company's number one priority? I understand you're a nationwide shipping company, but this one pallet of 2 drums is the most important thing you have in your inventory, you effers.
Gosh, it's such a weird situation to be in for the very first time in 10 years. And one of the things we keep saying, and we certainly say it on the podcast, is we keep experiencing the wildest things for the very first time. Global pandemic. Oh, never experienced that before. What does that look like? Okay. Oh, loss of business travel? Well, I haven't experienced that before. Okay. Can't go to Scotland, can't go to Seattle, can't go anywhere. Okay, what does that look like? Conducting interviews remotely and having the interviewee saving files to their local device and then sending it to us. Never done that before. Oh, 2 lost casks. Okay, never done that before. I'm tired of these firsts. I want some new, better firsts, Joshua.
Yeah, all I have going in my head right now is Madonna's Like a Virgin. And where we felt like a virgin each and every time some new situation comes on our lap. I'm tired of feeling like a virgin.
Royally fucked for the very first time.
Hey, royally fucked for the very first time.
I remember that lyric, but, they might have played a different version on the radio in the UK. So there you go. There's the Westland. There's no tidy bow here. That's just an ongoing situation. And in the interest of keeping listeners up to speed, there you go. Do with that what you will. I'll close out with some good news.
I like good news.
US retail release number 7 has been bottled, has been labelled, has been packaged. We're just trying our damnedest to get it into the country, which is not easy at this time.
It's not easy at this time. So that's the good news. The obstacle in our way is that there is a global shipping container.
Yeah, this is the very first time again.
For the very first time, like a surgeon. We're in the midst of a global shipping container shortage. So in previous years, if we wanted to ship whiskey from Scotland to the U.S. and put it on a boat, it would take about 6 weeks to get here. Spend a week or 2 at the port, but then it would get into our warehouse. You're looking at now about a minimum of 4 months to get to the port. And let's say we wanted to avoid shipping by boat. Let's get it over by air. Well, shipping by air is usually about a 1-week lead time with a week at the port. And it would cost more than ocean freight, no doubt about it. But, you could stomach that. Now air freight is around 4 weeks to port with another week at the port before it gets to our warehouse. And the cost is a good 4 times what it was previously. So we are in what I think the kids say a pickle.
While racing against the merely suspended tariffs, which may or may not come back into effect in August. Tariffs. I missed those off my list of a moment ago. Tariffs between allies. Yeah, that's a thing.
Would you call this a shit show? Like, would this be deemed a shit show?
Yes. I would not hesitate for a nanosecond to call all of this a shit show. And what's kind of interesting about it, and I've done this myself, and I continue to do this myself as a consumer. I'm like, where's the next whiskey coming from? Who's, have Smoss done anything recently? Have Cadenheads put out anything to the US recently? Like, where's the whiskey? I could go out and buy some new whiskies. There's this new Kilchoman coming with the PX maturation. I'm reaching out. I've got friends reaching out to me.
It hasn't hit the warehouse yet.
I reached out to you. Yeah. Right? How's that looking? Where's that at? And it's... On one end, I still want to be excited by new whiskies, and I still want to be eager to see new whiskies. And on the other side, I know that right now this is a gigantic... I would even go beyond shit show to shit storm.
Oh, I thought you were going to go to clusterfuck. I thought we were in the area of clusterfuck.
Not there yet. When we can't get a container, when we can't get a shipping date, then we're going to have a clusterfuck.
I think our two Westland drums should be categorized as a clusterfuck.
See, we're still in a holding pattern though. Like it's right now, it's Schrodinger's Westlands.
It is Schrodinger's Westlands,
right. Yeah. They're neither over nor being bottled. They are somewhere in between those two states, and we just don't know what state they're in. Literally. Sorry.
Wow.
They might be in Kentucky. They might be in Illinois. They might be in California.
I'll tell you, if we find these casks and they get bottled, I think we have to put on a special secondary label that is just called Schrodinger's casks. I think we need to do that.
You should write that down because we're both going to forget. And then when we don't do it, our listeners are going to remember and say, well, weren't you going to put a secondary label called Schrodinger's casks? And we'll be like, that's a brilliant idea. Did we come up with that? And they'll say it was in a podcast. Was it?
Well, we could tell them that there are labels. We just don't know where they are. They're Schrodinger's labels.
My takeaway from the news segment is this. We are really happy with the whiskies that we have in the 7th US retail release.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And there's a 2003 Orkney coming for online that is collaboration with the Water of Life film. And I have been waxing lyrical to anybody who will listen about the Orkney. I'm in love. I've got a contender for SCN whiskey of 2021.
Can I tell you my thought on that Orkney, the 17-year-old Orkney?
Yes, but I'm also, once it's actually released, you and I are going to discuss it more on the podcast.
Then I won't discuss it. Or should I?
Yeah, we're going to forget. Let's get it on wax.
In the early 2000s, there was a distillery on Orkney called Highland Park. You may have heard of them.
Familiar, yep.
We actually mentioned them a few times in this podcast today. And in the early 2000s, they released a series of single casks in partnerships with various distributors around the world and bars like Delilah's, shops like Binny's, and you name it. And the ages of those whiskeys ranged from like 13 years up to 34, 35 years. And they were all remarkable. I would suggest that the more recent single cask releases from this distillery, for whatever reason, were not up to the legendary status of those old ones. For whatever reason, and I don't know why. But in tasting that 17-year-old, and you said yes to it before I tasted it, which is kind of a rare thing. You and I try to say yes to things together. And you said, holy crap, this is a yes. And then you sent me a sample. And it is of the quality of those legendary early 2000 releases. Like, the quality is remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. I can't believe we have...
Yeah, I remember picking up a 19-year-old single cask from Beltramos in Palo Alto, California.
Ah, yeah.
Spectacular. Went back, bought another couple of bottles of it, shared it with my Palouse Whiskey Society. And it was one of those, like, if every Highland Park tasted like this, I would go bankrupt because I would buy every single one of them. I was almost happy that there was a bit of relief after those legendary releases where we could actually catch our breath and restock our bank accounts.
Right, and it was around that time that Paul F. Pacult. We're gonna destroy every name, but that's when he called Highland Park, the best spirit in the world, right? It was that same time frame. Granted, he was talking about their 18-year-old, and that was his whiskey of the year, 5 years running. But back then, the Highland Park 18-year-old was of a similar quality of those single casks.
Well, and I only called it Highland Park because it was life. It really was life. And the 18 sealed the deal.
And the 36-year-old was a double Highland Park. See what I did there? yeah. Every Jewish listener knows.
This guy gets it. Okay, let's wrap up the news. I hope we ended on a positive note. That was a tricky news segment there, but let me just quite done.
I just wanted to highlight one thing that you said sort of in passing, and I know you did it on purpose, but I want to highlight the fact that this Orkney is a collaborative bottling with the Water of Life film, which we're really happy with. The movie makers, I think, did a wonderful job. There's a bit more to this collaboration that we'll share at a future date. I don't want to show all of our cards, but just, watch this space. We'll be sharing more details as we get closer to the release of that bottling.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
With the news segment firmly behind us, Jason, you had told me you had an email you wanted to bring to us, to our listeners. Who's it from, and what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm sure you remember the name Mike Gore.
Yeah, of course.
Mr. Man in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So he has an opening paragraph about bidding on bottles.
Bidding?
That we maybe talk about from time to time. But
okay.
There's personal information in there, so I'm going to leave that part out. He says, I have a 2-part question for you. You mentioned the many benefits to cask strength bottling before. Mm-hmm. One of the benefits being the ability to dilute it later to whatever you choose. Is there a benefit in a diluted bottled whiskey having increased time for the water and whiskey to meld/integrate? That's the first question. I will give you the floor on the first, and then we'll return to the second.
Well, I would say there's no doubt about it. There are plenty of whiskeys out there, be they single malts or blends or bourbons or what have you, that are bottled at 43%, 46%, and they're perfectly good whiskeys. Some of them are perfectly excellent whiskeys. Did the water help that? Perhaps. The problem is that ABV is always fixed, right? You don't know if that whiskey would have been better at 47.4% or 44.6% or what have you, right? They're always looking to fix an ABV because that's what the labels are approved for, or this is the strength that they want to put their foot forward with, and so on. And so I would say, yes, those are great whiskeys. Let me answer it further this way. And I learned about this through our friends at Penderyn, right? When they first looked to release their whiskeys early doors, right? Mid-2000s or so. And they went to France because the French market is just a huge market for whiskey. And they said, here's the whiskey that we want to release, and, dear distributor, are you interested in this? And they say, first off, this is a fantastic whiskey. But what's the ABV on it? It's 46%. You're going to have to lower that for the French market. And they wanted them to go for 40%. long story short, they ended up making those whiskeys at 41%. But the point that I'm trying to get at is, for them, it wasn't merely a matter of, okay, the next batch just needs to be diluted more. They had to change the construction of that and select their casks in such a way to bottle it at a specific ABV.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that it's necessarily a matter of, let's put whiskey together and dilute it and put it out and you've got a great whiskey. I think you've got a bit more intention going on to ensure that at that ABV it's going to taste the way they want it to taste.
Which was exactly the conversation we had with James Saxon at the bar in Milroy's in London, January of 2020, saying, was that on the Spaniard maybe that we were discussing at that time? It was the
Spaniard, yeah, because it was 43% or something.
Right, and me saying, a little bit more oomph there, I'd love to see what it would do, and him saying, well, when we brought the batch together, we tested it at numerous different strengths, and 43 is where that batch shone through.
Yeah,
I think it makes your point for you.
Yeah, cool.
The other thing I would push back on with what you're saying there, though, is you don't get to sample it at 47.4 or 46.3 or what have you. I think as you're adding water to a cask strength whiskey, none of us really know the strength we're taking it to. We just know we're taking it down from the point that it says on the label. To
a place that we prefer it, where we prefer the experience.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
But we don't know if we took it down to 47.4. We don't know if we took it down to 46.3. We just know we took it down, And that is kind of my point there is, and we've said this so often, we release bottles at a cask strength that we think is immediately drinkable, straight from the bottle. But everyone's palate is different. And why not take it down? It's the getting it at 43 and knowing you can't go anywhere from there that's problematic. Yeah. Or 46 and knowing you can't really go anywhere from there that's problematic. For me, it's the fun of playing around with it.
Yeah, and there's another way to do it as well, and I quite like Ollie's approach on this. So Ollie Chilton, our good friend, who does he does many things, but for this story, when he's focusing on single malts of Scotland, he doesn't just taste a cask and bottle it. He plays around with the ABV a little bit. So maybe it was naturally 54% alcohol, but he brings it down to 53.4 because it just drinks better to him with that little addition of water. Maybe he brings it down 2 points, right? So there are ways that you could still bottle really high strength whiskey, but bring it to a level that you, the bottler, are most happy with. And so then you get to do what Michael's talking about there, where you are diluting it ahead of time. But again, it's to the preference of that bottler, and not necessarily a fixed ABV that's on a legacy label.
But I think there's still this interesting question about the amount of time for melding and integration. As you sit there of an evening just dropping in water, it's immediate, and things are happening in that immediate moment. If you're letting it sit and letting it marry and letting it meld and integrate, then I love my Glasgow blend at 43% alcohol, and it has sat with that water for a good while. It's come across an ocean. Yeah. They've really gotten to know each other very well, and I think that provides a different experience than if I got Glasgow blend at 46% and added a couple of drops of water to bring it to 43 in the moment. I think it's a different experience.
So what you do is you get the bottling at 46%, you add the water, then wait 3-6 months or what have you, then go back to it. I think that's...
Well, we're not drinking the neck portion anymore, right? The neck portion goes down the sink, make space for the water to dilute.
No. Anybody's listening to this, there's no such thing as pouring the contents of the neck of your bottle down the drain. That is ill-advised. Put it in a little bottle.
Secondly,
What's that? But right, we talked about this before. Put that in a little bottle. Drink your bottle. Once you get to the end of that bottle, then compare the two. See what you like more.
the neck pour has no chance.
No chance.
It's the neck. Something reversing in your driveway.
Yeah.
FedEx
garbage.
coming the full length of your driveway.
Yeah, the full girth as well.
You're going to have to repave that. Secondly, from Mike Gore, do you believe whiskey ages or improves in the bottle with age? I had always accepted this as a given, that whiskey did not age once in glass, but have since read a little of quote-unquote old bottle effect. Perhaps it's a bit like the pitch drop experiment, in that the change is so subtle and gradual that it is only perceptible after a great passage of time. He then includes a link to the vintagenews.com titled The Pitch Drop Experiment. And he asks, is it possible whiskey stored properly away from light and temperature fluctuations still changes over time?
I think it's important to, when talking about the idea of whiskey changing in a bottle, so we're talking about it in the correct way, that it can do simply that, change a bit within the bottle. It's not an aging thing. You're not gaining more years, because the years gained, like actual noticeable year over year changes in flavors, only happens in wood. But you will get, and therefore that's an aging process. When you have whiskey and you put it in a bottle, you may not understand the bottle effect on that whiskey, assuming it's a closed bottle, for a few decades, right? Especially if it's stored properly, no light, no temperature fluctuation. It's not a volatile situation. If you, and obviously our listeners can't see it, right? But if you take a prized bottle and you put parafilm wax around the capsule and cork, you're going to ensure that alcohol isn't evaporating out and oxygen isn't getting in. So there's a way to prolong the life of your whiskey in the bottle, but you will see changes. I wouldn't call it age.
Actually, Ryan Maloney was just mentioning this over the weekend at the World Whisky Summit, where he was talking about the cork being such a terrible closure. And, yes, we've known this, but we've fallen into the pattern of the best whiskies come with corks, that we continue to live with corks on the top of our bottles. And Ryan, who's in retail up in Massachusetts, is busy saying the screw top is the best closure for your whiskey. And it's so interesting
whiskey, yeah.
Watching you here taking out the parafilm, right? We're adding another layer to the cork to try and stop, evaporation. You see old bottles drop down to the shoulders, getting rid of the neck pour in a traditional way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to me, and you and I just had this last Friday. We were dramming during our weekly meeting, and I pulled down the bottle that I talked about at the turn of the year being my 2020 non-SCN Whiskey of the Year, which was the Whiskey Exchange Le Chig.
Yeah.
And as I returned to it, I've got maybe, what did I show you the other day? Maybe a third of a bottle left.
About that.
And you opened a fresh bottle. And I'm busy lamenting, this has really softened in the time it's been open. This isn't the same, it doesn't deliver the same pungency that it did when it was first opened. And I think that if I'd left that cork with that wax, and I'll be able to do the experiment because I have acquired another couple, I'll be able to cut the wax, pop the cork, pour a fresh one right next to this one that has been sitting on my shelf, and I'll be able to see, is it my memory? Am I remembering it as more pungent than it was? Right? And that's my comment on this always, is that we often have no control, right? And if you're going to do a scientific experiment, you need to have a control. You need to be able to compare it to something. Mm-hmm. And all we're ever comparing it to are our own memories. And those are imprecise at best.
And that's why I suggested the neck pour. Just go into a little mini, right? And then you can actually have that control sample to... And if the whiskey isn't doing what you thought it used to do, well, now you have a sample that you can compare it next to if you don't have that second bottle, right? If you don't have that backup bottle.
What if I made a 750 ml sample of the one I'm opening?
I think that would work. I
Cool.
do want to...
Asking for a friend.
I want to make a slight point of clarification, though. So I agree with Ryan Maloney. An actual cork for a whiskey bottle is a terrible closure. But the reason why it's been used is that's the traditional thing you use for closing up bottles, right? And it comes from wine. But in the wine world, the cork is the perfect closure, especially if you want to store that wine, because you're going to store your wine on the side. The wine's going to hit the cork. The cork is going to get engorged a bit with that wine to make a perfect seal. And I love your face when I said engorged. And, similar to a cask, right? What makes a wooden cask such a great vessel for a spirit or a fermented drink is that liquid is getting soaked up by the wood, it's getting engorged, and you get a perfect seal. But with whiskey and cork, there's so much alcohol within whiskey that it doesn't do the cork any justice. It'll eat away at the cork, and then the cork gets into your whiskey, and it just ends up being a bad situation. This is why you never store your whiskey bottles on their side. And if you don't have liquid touching the cork could dry out, and that's where you get your evaporation of the alcohol. That's when the oxygen comes in, right? So it's this thing that you have to be cognizant of, and that's why we use the parafilm wax or a screw top on some bottles, like Westland use a screw top, right? Perfect little callback to why we're here in the first place.
Oh, well, I'll say something nice. That was a lovely clarification. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for taking the time to clarify.
You're very welcome.
And then for my own callback, Mike's email came in the middle of April, and he signs off by saying, "The prospect of new wild turkey from you has me very much looking forward to entering your next lottery."
Lovely, jubbly. I don't know who's won what because I don't look at those things. Hopefully he won.
Yeah, I don't know either. I take care of the logistics side of it. I didn't pay attention to his name, so sorry about that, Mike. Good. I hope it worked. There you go. There's how fair we are. A lovely email didn't affect the lottery. Lottery is the lottery is the lottery.
Yep. All right, Jason, I don't think we've... Oh, well, you know what? We don't have anything left, but I really loved Mike's email. We actually got an email from James Saxon, too, that I want to read in our next podcast, potentially. I have to reread it to make sure that it's for the podcast and not specifically for us.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I also, in the next episode, want us to revisit some folk who wrote in about their own selections for their top 10.
Perfect. Okay, so that'll be a nice segment for the next episode. For anybody else who wants to reach out to us, you could do so. questions@onenationunderwhiskey.com. Whiskey, of course, is always spelled without the E, never, ever, ever with the E with us. You could always tweet at us @OneNationWhiskey. You could Instagram us like Colin Mayers did, by the way, and I'll touch on that maybe in a future episode. We've been in conversation with him. He reached out to us on Instagram. We're @OneNationUnderWhiskey. And then finally, you can always check out our Facebook page or our Facebook group. Just go into the Facebook search bar, One Nation Under Whiskey.
Just very quickly, if I may, here
please.
at the very end, the feedback from that top 10 list has been remarkable, and it's not the type of thing that you or I took on lightly. I know it's very clickbaity. I know it's very whatever podcast baity is, right? To say, oh, do we have some information for you? Do delve in.
You won't believe what we have to say.
Right. You won't believe what number one is. And that's not why we did it.
No.
And as I've continued to do tastings and people have continued to ask me, what bottles do you recommend to somebody just getting into this? What would you say is a whiskey they should spend their hard-earned money on? I'm now more and more saying, funny you should ask. Joshua and I did a podcast on it.
Yes.
But what I've really liked about the nation reaching back out to us is it's a conversation. Here's ours. It's not definitive. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the 10 bottles every whiskey lover must own. No. It's, here's 5 things that Jason thinks you should include on your shelf. Here's 5 things Joshua thinks you should include on your shelf. And someone writes in and says, oh, and I'd add that, and I'd add that. So we'll circle back to that in a future episode as well. And here's some nation recommendations. But I'm really glad our listeners understood what we were trying to achieve with that podcast. And it was a response to a list that we took a little bit of umbrage with.
Good. Yep. I enjoyed that point of clarification as well. So here we are, Jason. This is the end.
Until next time.
My only friend, the end. All right, Jason. It's been a time.
It's merely a parting, not an ending.
That's true.
Until next time.
Until then.
2 chins?
Shit, why stop there? Why not both? Wait, no, that is both. Yes, 2 chins.